your priority is to solve technical AGI alignment, correct?
Yeah, I would like there to be a plan, a technical plan, such that somebody has some idea about what kind of code to write, where they write that code, and the AGI isn't trying to kill its programmers and kill its users and kill everybody else.
Welcome to Doom Debates. Dr. Stephen Byrnes is an artificial intelligence safety researcher at the Astera Institute. He has a BA in physics and math from Harvard. He did his PhD in physics at UC Berkeley. He wrote his dissertation on solar cells, laser physics, and physical chemistry. He also did a physics postdoc at Harvard, where he did research in thermodynamics and optics. And then in 2015 to 2021, he worked at a nonprofit applied physics research and development laboratory called Draper. Then, since 2021, he's been doing AGI safety research, first independently and now at the Astera Institute. Now, you're probably thinking, this guy sounds like an average guy. One sec, I'll do that. This guy is in fact legit. He was a winner of the USA Math Olympiad and the USA Physics Olympiad in high school. And he won first place nationally in the Siemens Westinghouse competition with a math project. So it's always great when I have a guest who's bringing in that raw intellectual horsepower and achievement. I'm blown away by his body of research because his write-ups, which I encourage you guys to check out, it's linked in the show notes, his write-ups are incredibly brilliant and thorough, and I agree with virtually 100% of his claims. I invited him on Doom Debates to ask him the same question that I asked Jim Babcock a few weeks ago. What's the mainline Doom scenario? We're going to talk about Steve's model of what true AGI will look like, how soon it's coming, what his mainline Doom scenario is, and how to actually solve AI alignment on a technical level. Steve Byrnes, welcome to Doom Debates.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so really a lot to get to. I've spent the last couple of weeks really diving into the Steve universe. And overall, I'm just so impressed. I feel like you are Leibniz to Eliezer's Newton. Like, you guys are independently thinking along a lot of the same lines. Each of you kind of reinforces the other, but it seems like you came at it from independent directions. Is that fair to say?
I think Eliezer has had good ideas, and I try to internalize and copy the good ideas when I notice them, and don't claim that everything that I've written is something that I independently made up.
Fair enough. So I just want to dive a little bit more into what you see are your mental strengths, because it does seem like you've got a combination of skills that I describe as mental superpowers, because not only are you very good at math, but then you combine it with like independently doing research and synthesizing a bunch of concepts and writing a synthesis that I think makes a lot of sense. So like, what do you see as like your unique mental superpower?
Well, maybe other people should decide for themselves what I'm good and bad at. I do think I have a personality that's well suited to my current job. I hate hands-on work, and I'm really bad at it, and I don't have to do that. I hate management and mentorship, and I'm really bad at it, and I don't have to do that either. I do like patiently arguing on technical points online for extended periods of time. I was doing that as a Wikipedia editor 20 years ago. I've been doing it ever since in lots of my free time. So that seems to be something that I take to very well. And I sometimes listen to other independent researchers struggle with some aspects of the job that seem to come very easily to me. So I'm lucky in that respect.
That's right. Yeah. So I saw you've been spending like decades helping explain stuff clearly online. And a lot of the Wikipedia articles that are about physics have a lot of paragraphs contributed by you, right?
Yeah. I wrote a whole lot of Wikipedia physics articles. Of course, they've all been totally bastardized since I last edited them. I haven't really edited for the last 10 years.
Well, but you gave them a good start to run with.
Yeah.
Well, I was impressed when I read your history of researching cold fusion. So you write on your website, everyone knows there's no such thing as cold fusion, but I didn't want to take anyone's word for it. I wanted to check for myself. Thus, I made a hobby out of carefully reading the papers and studying the arguments of cold fusion proponents. After 29 blog posts over 4 years, I concluded that the mainstream consensus is correct. There is indeed no such thing as cold fusion. Meanwhile, the blog was a nice excuse to write lots of fun pedagogical posts about quantum optics, nuclear physics, relativistic quantum mechanics, Bose-Einstein condensation, statistical mechanics, and much more. So when I read that, I'm like, okay, well, there's definitely a lot of unique factors coming into play in order to be able to do an exercise like this, right? Because like most of us would be like, okay, let me just Google if cold fusion real. Seems like probably not. Okay, I'm out, right? That's like me. But you're like, oh, let me just learn a little bit about relativistic quantum mechanics and write 29 blog posts about that and related topics. So for me, that's like, okay, well, you got the baseline math and logic talent. You're good at like learning, right? Diving into like this independent research. Like you want to go see for yourself why something is true instead of just learning from a textbook. And then you've got the productivity aspect where you'll actually go write something up, right? You won't like you won't like take forever to write a post. So it seems like you've got like a high output going. Is that like a good breakdown of your skill set?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I don't know.
The other thing that I'm seeing is prioritization. So it seems like you have good taste, right? Like you go into a field and you're not just going to like go get bogged down in like a random aspect of it. You're like, okay, well, these seem like the big ideas. Let me focus on those. And again, that's also something that I think Eliezer has. Do you notice that in yourself where you're like, oh yeah, this is what's important, and other people are like wasting their time?
I mean, ultimately, we're gonna find out whether AI kills everybody or not, and from the pearly gates, we can decide whether my work was productive or not. So it's a little bit terrifying in that respect. I'm doing the best I can. I'd like to think that I'm working on what's important and making progress. I'm sure a lot of, hopefully most other people would say the same thing about their own work. Yeah, time will tell.
Fair enough. Okay, the other piece that I've noticed is even though your background is in physics and math, it seems like you've gotten really knowledgeable about neuroscience. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so after I finished my last hobby, which was this cold fusion blog that you mentioned, I was ready for a new hobby. This was like 2018, 2019. And I decided my next hobby was going to be AGI safety. And I didn't really have high expectations for myself. I figured I could at least, leave comments on other people's blog posts, produce some pedagogy or something. And so I started getting into that. I wrote a few blog posts on this newfangled thing called GPT-2, but eventually got interested in this thing where I heard a podcast where I think Jeff Hawkins went on, what was it, Lex Friedman or something, and he said, "Hi, Jeff Hawkins understands the brain, and it turns out that the secret sauce of human intelligence is the neocortex, which is this like 70% or so of the brain that includes vision areas and motor control, reasoning, language, all these other things." And he says, it turns out that the whole cortex is more or less a uniform learning algorithm. This is called cortical uniformity. It's this theory from the 1970s. And he said, it's just this big randomly initialized learning algorithm.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if he would have put it that way, but that's how I put it. And I, Jeff Hawkins, am well on my way to understanding exactly how that learning algorithm works, and that I'm going to invent AGI, and it's going to be awesome. So that was Jeff Hawkins's pitch.
When did you first hear Jeff Hawkins say that stuff? When did you get into him?
This must have been 2019, I think.
You know, that's interesting because I actually got into Jeff Hawkins myself in like 2006, just listening to his TED talk. And then, that I think On Intelligence came out around then. And I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, this guy's got it. But unlike you, I'm just like, okay, well, let me just go back to being a software engineer now. But you're like, oh, let me actually go look deeper.
Yeah, and Andrew Nig, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Andrew Ng.
Eng, yeah, supposedly was inspired by that to go into to deep learning. He saw the light that large scale learning algorithms could do a lot if they're scaled up.
Hmm.
So yeah, the cortex has, what is it, 100 million cortical mini columns, and they're all pretty similar. They all have, well, they generally have 6-ish layers. Some of them have 5, and some of them have more than 6. There's sub layers, whatever. But anyway, it's this whole like 6-layered motif that's repeated over and over again. That's sort of vaguely like what eventually happened with large scale learning algorithms in deep learning. But of course, Jeff Hawkins would say, no, that's the wrong kind of learning algorithm. The brain is different from deep learning.
And is he correct?
I do think that Jeff Hawkins is correct that that the cortex learning algorithm is pretty different from deep learning. I don't think that Jeff Hawkins's particular ideas are all on the right track, or that he's on the cusp of figuring it out. But just the idea that the cortex is a big learning algorithm was very interesting to me, because it did seem like nobody else in AGI safety at the time was like asking the question of, okay, what if he's right? What would be the
Hmm.
implications for safe and beneficial AGI? And also, is he right? Should we believe him? So that got me interested in that question. It also leads to a bunch of related neuroscience questions, namely, if the cortex is a big learning algorithm, then how do you explain everything in developmental psychology, everything in, evolutionary behavior? How does all that work? And there's just lots of follow-up questions that nobody seemed to be asking. What's the big picture? What's the bigger picture in which this cortical uniformity ingredient fits? So I sort of got curious about that and started teaching myself neuroscience over the past 5, 6 years from that starting point, first in my free time. And then when I got a full-time job, I was able to spend more time on it.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So at this point, I feel like, even though I can't say neuroscience is your credential, it certainly seems like you're as conversant in neuroscience as somebody with a bachelor's, master's. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I'm happy to take on anybody in a neuroscience quiz bowl.
Yeah. We got to get you in the neuroscience Olympiad.
I have lots of idiosyncratic opinions about neuroscience. I would probably flunk the quiz bowl by giving answers that are wrong according to the textbooks, but correct according to me.
I know what you mean. Yeah. I mean, not, I don't have neuroscience opinions. It's not my field of study, but like, I know what it looks like when a field has like everybody running in one direction where it's like, what the hell, guys? Like I've seen it in a couple fields, quantum theory. I mean, are you one of those people who are like, obviously the many worlds interpretation is correct?
Yeah, I am one of those people.
Yeah, same here, same here. When did you first encounter Eliezer Yudkowsky's sequences, and when did you become AGI-pilled?
I heard about AGI now and then over the course of the 2010s. I think I read Superintelligence in 2016, a couple of years after it came out. But at the time, I was like, this is an AI problem, and I'm a physicist, so hopefully other people will deal with it because I'm doing my thing as a physicist.
Hmm.
What do I know about AI? But over time, I did actually get to learn a little bit of AI through my job, um, and I also did a little bit of brain computer interface and other work that's a little bit related. Then when it was time to pick this new hobby in 2018 or 2019, I figured maybe I'll give it a go. So that would have been the time that I started reading seriously, like a lot more of writing on that topic, and reading the massive trove of work by Eliezer Yudkowsky was one part of that.
You did actually go ahead and read through the whole sequences, right?
I've probably read virtually all of it by this point.
Did you then read Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality?
I think I read that much later.
Did you then go and read his various BDSM, other types of fiction?
I have not read that.
Yeah, I haven't actually gotten through that myself, so I can't say that I've read the full Eliezer corpus, but I have read 300% of the sequences in that. I just keep reading them over and over again. I find them very insightful. So that's good background about where you're coming from and how you got AGI pilled. And when we say you're AGI pilled, just to state the obvious, it just means that you agree that AGI is potentially in the near term, not even in the long term, in the near term, like a crazy huge deal, like the biggest shakeup that the planet has ever seen, maybe ever.
Well, that depends on how near is near. There's a word in the air that if you don't think AGI is going to arrive before my afternoon coffee, then that's long timelines in this day and age. I don't think, I don't expect AGI this year. I don't expect AGI next year. I think that, I don't know what Dario Amodei is smoking that he thinks that we'll have like Nobel Prize winning original research in 2027. But if we're talking about what's going to happen in my lifetime, then for sure, I think AGI is very likely and is a very, very, very big deal.
I think I agree with you, but I also think we should clarify when you say like, yeah, what is Dario smoking? Like novel research by end of 2027. Okay, but what probability do you give that? Obviously not zero. Probably at least 1%, right?
I don't know, low enough that it doesn't factor into decisions about what I do on my day-to-day life.
So like very roughly like 1 to 10%.
I guess there's a way that people use probabilities in practice, which is like there's the main line, the thing that you're kind
Hmm.
of centrally expecting, the maximum a posteriori scenario that you're kind of expecting to live. And then you have sort of this abstract ideas of other things that might happen. And ideally, you take actions where those sort of other branches, you don't want to be like screwing over the world in those other branches. But you're not necessarily like living in that scenario. And then there's other things that you just view as so improbable that it's okay to, do things that are counterproductive if those things are true. I'm happy to report that I don't think I'm screwing anybody over in the hypothetical world where Dario Abade is right about AGI arriving and superintelligence coming in, the next couple of years. Because of that, I don't feel like I need to think too hard about exactly what probability I assign to it, other than like pretty low.
All right, let's talk about your research direction. So, the 10,000 foot view, very high level, it seems like your priority is to solve technical AGI alignment, correct?
Yeah, I would like there to be a plan, a technical plan, such that, somebody has some idea about what kind of code to write, where they write that code, and the AGI isn't trying to kill its programmers and kill its users and kill everybody else.
It's rare to find a guy who actually understands the technical issues and is actually saying like, okay, yeah, I understand this, but I'm going to try to solve it. Like that was basically what Miri was trying to say before. And now they've kind of given up. I mean, they still have some researchers doing research, but they're basically like, yep, we decided the problem's intractable. Whereas you're here being like, well, I understand Miri's ideas. I understand why it's difficult. I think most of the ideas are true, but I'm here trying to solve it.
Yep, I'm trying, and I don't claim to have a viable plan as of right now. So we can time will tell whether I'm over optimistic or not.
Do you agree with my assessment that when you look around the landscape, you see other people like, oh, they work for AI safety as part of one of these AI companies, but they're not on the same page about like all the Eliezer Yudkowsky problems, right? So they're not even like seeing important obstacles in the field that they think that they're navigating, and then you do, but you're still trying to solve it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. There's a very common position these days that involves sort of extrapolating alignment of current large language models to alignment of future powerful AGI. And I think they're going to be sufficiently disanalogous that research program is going to wind up. People are going to be unpleasantly surprised about how future AI turns out.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm a little more sympathetic to like it's an understandable mistake kind of thing, but I do think they're wrong. So I guess I agree on that level.
Yeah, I know what you're getting at. So, for the viewers, I think what's happening is you've got a lot of these people at the AI companies, and I think Sam Altman pretty much said it. He's like, yeah, all these people who are AI doomers 10 years ago, they gave us all these warnings, and then we built LLMs, and we got to a future that they couldn't even imagine. Computers talking to us without killing us. The doomers never imagined this. So, you gotta just stop listening to the doomers. That's essentially like the perspective of a lot of these people at these AI companies. Like, okay, let's dismiss the doomers now because LLMs are nothing like the doomers ever imagined. And then you and I are on the same page of like, okay, well, LLMs are very interesting, but they're ultimately a pit stop on the road to the same doomy future that the doomers are warning about.
Yeah, that's my take. We don't have the really powerful kind of AI yet, so the jury's out on what it will be like and whether it will be, as omnicidal as I and the other doomers have been saying.
And we're going to dive into that because you have a lot of interesting ideas about why that's going to be the case, why LLMs aren't the same thing as the super intelligent AI that's coming. Before we dive into that, just going back to your research program and your goal to solve technical alignment, I want to kind of spoil the ending and tell people what you've landed on your research direction, which is basically quoting your own words, reverse engineering human social instincts on like a neuroscience brain algorithm level, correct?
Yeah, I think we should think of the human brain as doing some kind of model-based reinforcement learning, and it has a reward function that says that pain is bad and that eating when you're hungry is good. These are and a bunch of other things like that. These are sometimes called innate drives or primary rewards, primary reinforcers, primary punishers, and depending on what field you're in. And I think these are like basically some innate set of drives that makes humans like to do some things and dislike other things. And a subset of that is human social instincts that make us want to do what the cool kids are doing in school, that makes us want to feel compassion in some cases and spite in other cases and bloodlust in other cases. So we have this whole suite of social instincts for better and for worse. And I think that when we make powerful AI, my central expectation is that it's going to be a more similar architecture to how the human brain works. So by the same token, there will be a reward function, and the programmers get to put whatever they want into that reward function. So if we want the AIs to feel compassion, then it would be a good jumping off point to understand how the human brain builds compassion.
Hmm. I talk a lot on this program about the difficulty of steering AI, and I think that the AI companies are nowhere near being able to steer it. And most of them, my impression is they even admit that. They admit like, yeah, it's an open problem, but we're working on it. We're going to get the AI to help us. So there's a lot of consensus on the idea that like, yeah, AI steering is hard. It's an open problem. And of course, you've got these problems with like Grok calling it Mega Hitler. That's probably not exactly what the team wanted. So steering is a challenge. And I would describe your ultimate goal. This is my take on it. Tell me if this is correct. You want to understand how the human brain steers itself. So then we understand how to steer AIs or program steering into the AIs. And then the ultimate goal is that we get the AIs to steer the world as an IQ augmented human would steer it.
I mostly agree with that. I feel like I want to push back and say that if we're really just talking about the LLMs that exist today, there is in fact room for improvement in making, O3 lie less. I expect that give it a year or two and O3 will actually lie less and deceive less. I think that Grok will stop calling itself Mecha Hitler if you give it enough time. I think that these are tractable problems that people are iterating on and they'll solve. And I'm more uh, interested in the disanalogies between the LLMs of 2025 and the more powerful AIs of the future, and why we should expect those disanalogies, if indeed we should expect those disanalogies. Um, in terms of what you said, yeah, so evolution needs to build a brain that exhibits flexible behavior towards genetic fitness, enhancing things like finding healthy food and, having high status in your hunter-gatherer tribe and attracting mates. If evolution is just programming a reflex, like if there's a, you know, dark expanding blob in my field of view, then I should flinch my head because probably something is heading towards my face. You don't need reinforcement learning for that. You don't need any kind of interesting like solution to that problem. You just detect you build a dark expanding blob detector into the brain and you wire it up to the like flinch reaction and problem solved. But humans are also systematically doing flexible, motivated, foresighted behavior towards things like, helping their kids. And it would be interesting to know how that works.
Yeah, let's talk about what it looks like to solve alignment, because that's even part of the problem is talking coherently about what a solution looks like. You have a very helpful post. It's called Four Visions of Success, and you break it down into helper/tool AIs, autonomous AIs, human intelligence augmentation, or don't build ASI, right? Those are your four distinctions. So I think that's pretty clear. I mean, I guess the problem with helper/tool is that it just puts a cap on how much it can do. I mean, already we're surpassing that, right? We're like, okay, agent, write my code, right?
So there's something that's a little bit in between, which I've always thought of as under the term ambitious value learning, where there's an AI that is interested in helping person X achieve their long-term goals, including like if they need to put person X in a bunker for 5 years and fight an autonomous war on their behalf, that they're making decisions that person X would endorse in hindsight. So if you take some vision like that and just imagine that that's easily achievable by just saying, hey, Claude, look after my long-term best interest, or hey, ChatGPT or whatever. If you sort of imagine that that's the case, then you wind up with this thing that's not exactly what I thought of as a helper AI, and it's also not exactly what it's sort of neither of the above, but I do think that's what some people have in mind.
And so you're saying the distinction between helper and autonomous, there might be like something in between.
I think so. I'm not sure exactly how to articulate or think about it. I'm still a little confused on that topic. But yeah, when we talk about solving technical alignment, I sort of have that as part of this like bigger picture of I don't want the AIs to kill me. There are some additional questions of like align to what? What are we actually trying to make the AIs do? And there's different stories there, and I don't have a strong take right now, except that the AI that wants to kill all humans is bad, and it should be at least possible to do anything else besides that.
Now, the problem with autonomous AIs is that they might run away with no off button, and you were hoping to debug them, and now it's too late to debug them, right? That's kind of like the obvious problem.
Yeah, it's a single point of failure. Yeah.
And then human intelligence augmentation, I feel like Eliezer Yudkowsky these days is acting like that would be the holy grail. Like if we could just do human intelligence augmentation, we would have like, I don't know, tens of percentages of chance of solving the alignment problem as opposed to like less than 10% with just building AI from scratch. So that seems to be where Eliezer's head is. And it makes sense to me that it like gives us a decent shot. You know, if you start with a human, well, you're still probably going to get a human. I don't know. I think you might have pointed out that supercharged biological brains might not be the holy grail. Like it might have its own issues.
Yeah. So Eliezer's perspective is, if I understand correctly, is that is not that it's like super promising, but that it's somewhat less doomed than every other possibility. So I guess if that's the starting point, then sure. But so like one problem is that presumably it would take a long time to do that. Another problem is that personality is an important ingredient into the mix in addition to intelligence. For example, Jan LeCun is clearly very intelligent, but he has very stupid ideas about AI alignment. And these ideas, it's been pointed out to him many times that he has misunderstandings about AI alignment, and I think he's got a lot of motivated reasoning going on. You know, I've written about exactly like his object level errors of
Mhm.
reasoning, but yeah, I mean, there's smart people with like who are still, not listening to reason and making ad hominem attacks and stuff like that.
In the case of like Jan LeCun being wrong, we have to figure out how much of that is intelligence limitations and how much of it is like a character flaw. And obviously, it's considered a low blow to just start assuming that somebody is wrong instead of just arguing object level. But I think maybe you were trying to connect to the point of like, if we scaled up Jan LeCun's brain, would that get us alignment? Well, maybe he would just keep being wrong, right? Is that basically what you're getting at?
What I'm getting at is let's put aside Jan LeCun or any individual person and just note that there's like smart people who disagree with each other about AI alignment. Um, I don't think that's just that they are all limited in intelligence. I think part of it is things like motivated reasoning. And then this sort of gets back to personality and motivation and truth seeking, which is a little harder to engineer. Like, I think personality is poorly understood. The things that people are talking about in terms of human intelligence augmentation, I think wouldn't work straightforwardly for personality. And it would be kind of dicey to even try.
Yep, makes sense. Now, your vision, basically what you think is the most likely thing to even aim for, you describe it as brain-like AGI with the better parts of reverse-engineered human social instincts. But it is autonomous, correct?
Yeah, I think there have to be AIs that are thinking about what would constitute a good future and autonomously making decisions in that direction, as opposed to following specific directions from humans.
Hmm.
So this can come about in a number of ways. We can talk about the starting point being, follow person X's long-term best interest, even if person X doesn't realize that something is in their long-term best interest, do it anyway. And then one potential vision for how to get there is maybe humans are able to autonomously act towards a good future, we hope. So whatever humans are able to do, humans are able to do moral philosophy to some extent. Maybe AIs that are sufficiently similar to humans can also do moral philosophy for the same reasons. Things like that. That seems like worth looking into. Again, I don't have a plan that I feel great about, but that's one of the directions that I'm looking into.
All right, viewers. So now you have a sense of where Steve is going with all this research, and all of his ideas kind of originate from trying to get to this endpoint. With that context, before we talk more about alignment, let's go back and talk about some of the core discoveries that you think, I mean, maybe they're not fully consensus yet, but they make a lot of sense. We're going to talk about the core discoveries that you've made on your way to solving this alignment problem, starting with this idea of the major two brain subsystems, steering brain versus learning from scratch brain. Explain that.
Okay, yeah, well, I wouldn't call it a discovery rather than a synthesis of things that have already been said.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that it's helpful to sort of divide the brain into two pieces. And one piece is doing large scale within lifetime learning algorithms. and the other piece is doing, yeah, I call it the steering subsystem, and it's full of what I call business logic. So business logic is this cool term from software engineering. So for example, if you're making tax software, it might say something like, if you have more than 200 employees, then fill out form 529X. And if you are registered in Texas, then attach form something or other. So all that is things that you might want to write code for, but the code that you're writing is directly related to the functional specification that you're trying to meet. So if I'm evolution and I'm building a brain, I likewise need to have a lot of business logic. If the person is fertile, then their sex drive should go up. If the person is, on the brink of starvation, then their pain tolerance should go up, and they should feel a hunger signal, and they should, stop doing non-shivering thermogenesis processes that burn energy to ward off hypothermia, and this and that and the other thing. There's just a bunch of probably hundreds or thousands of lines of effectively lines of code that evolution needs to build into the brain. And I think that if you look at the hypothalamus and you look at the brainstem and a couple other parts of the brain, they're just full of these kinds of business logic. Whereas if you look at the cortex, if you look at the cerebellum, the striatum, then what you see is these large scaled up learning algorithms where I think the right way to think about them is that they start out randomly initialized in effect. And then there's, loss functions, and there's hyperparameters, and there's learning rules. And over the course of lifetime, so they start out totally useless when they're first formed, but by the time you're an adult, your cortex is doing all kinds of useful things for you. And all the sort of flexible learned behavior is coming from those systems.
My position as somebody who hasn't really studied neuroscience, but will occasionally read like a popular book, and obviously I've read your stuff, I think you're probably right. It's feeling right to me, more likely than not, for what that's worth. So let me review my understanding for the viewers, basically recapping what you just said. So you've got the two brains, you've got the steering brain and the learning from scratch brain. The steering brain has the brainstem and the hypothalamus primarily, right? Because the brain has all these regions. And you're saying those two regions, which I think are also like the closest to the spinal cord, right? Like the most primitive regions. Is that right?
So I dispute the term primitive. If you go back 500 million years to the first vertebrate, our common ancestor with worms already had a steering subsystem and a learning subsystem, just as we do. But, but they're both much simpler than they are for us. It's not like the human hypothalamus stopped evolving. We have different instincts from chimps in many important ways. The things that make a chimp flinch are different than what make us flinch, and so on.
Yeah, I think it makes intuitive sense that things that are like developmentally earlier have more steering control. And maybe you can trace it all the way back to like the genes and the DNA, right? Those are like the ultimate, I don't know, the ultimate powerhouse. They're the ones who natural selection acts on, and then they build bodies around them. And then the parts of the body that got built later, right? Like the brain, the cortex is like evolutionarily new. And so it makes intuitive sense that, okay, the cortex came around in order to be the servant of the brainstem.
They're two gears in a car. I wouldn't say that either is the servant of the other. Even, you know, tiny worm-like creatures on the, digging in the sand of the early ocean, they still need to learn to navigate their environment. They still need memory. They still need, reinforcement learning. They still need this within lifetime learning, just because not everything about your situation can be specified by the genome in terms of reflexes. So reflexes are good. It's almost always a good bet to flinch if you see a dark, rapidly expanding blob in your field of view. But, the worm can learn that, there's a predator over here and there are predators over here. And that can be different from, where the predators were 20 years ago with its great grandparents. Those things where you're learning within your lifetime have always been important. And we should think of those as quite primitive too. So again, the human cortex is a direct descendant of the vertebrate pallium, and probably even related to things like the mushroom body in fruit flies.
Okay, I guess I had this naive mental model where it's like, okay, the brain stems first and then it grows the cortex out of it. But you're saying like, no, no, like the cortex had like an analog too that was also primitive.
Yeah, the cortex goes way, way, way back. They're all growing at the same time out of the embryonic neural plate.
So yeah, so zooming out again, so you got the steering brain, which is the brainstem and hypothalamus. You claim, right? Not 100% proven,
And,
but it
and,
seems like a good model.
and a couple other odds and ends. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And that's only 10% by volume, which to me makes intuitive sense because, yeah, I mean, steering, if you look at like the amount of business logic in a program, a lot of times like plumbing and libraries and sensors take up the majority of the program. And then the steering part is like relatively few lines of code, right?
Yeah. So in humans in particular, the learning subsystem is more than 90%. I think well over 90% of the volume of the brain. And I think of it as a little bit like, you know, GPT, there's like a lot of code that people write, but they're not writing 10 times more code when they make the number of parameters 10 times bigger when they go from GPT N to GPT N plus one. Or,
Right.
there's just so many learned parameters that it swamps everything else. So by the same token, when we evolved from chimps, our cortex got, what, 3 times bigger or something. And our striatum likewise got 3 times bigger. So that's like scaling up the learning algorithm. And that allows humans to learn more within their lifetime and learn more rich and complicated models of
Mhm.
the world. But that can happen with much less like evolutionary design than building 10 times more, 3 times more reflexes in the brainstem.
In your model of the world, in your model of the brain, the steering brain, the business logic that it's trying to use to steer, is actually traceable to genetic information and gene level learning across generations, which is like this slow type of learning that really can't accumulate that many bits compared to the cortex, where it's like the genes can say, okay, yeah, I want this twice as big. And then it uses the twice as big cortex within a single lifetime to just populate it with a bunch of these dynamic learnings.
Yeah, exactly. Just like scaling up deep learning models makes them learn cooler and better things.
Exactly. Okay, so we talked about the steering brain and then the learning from scratch brain. It's the biggest region. I guess it's like 90% of the brain by volume, correct?
Yeah, more than 90%. I don't know the exact numbers. It depends
Mhm.
on how you
And
count.
yeah, the major subsections of the learning from scratch brain, according to you, would be the cerebrum, obviously, right? That's like the most modern, biggest part by volume. But you also include the cerebellum, which might be an untraditional choice, right? Because when the little bit I know about the cerebellum, I thought it was all about like, coordinating muscle movements.
Yeah, but if you zoom into the cerebellum, what you find is sort of the same motif repeated over and over. This thing with Purkinje cells and climbing fibers. And, you find some ridiculously high number of granule cells. And I think like half the cells in the brain or something. And I think the right way to think about it is that it's a big learning algorithm. It's not a
Mhm.
particularly important one for AGI, but it is. And we can talk about exactly what I think it does, but I do think the right way to think about the cerebellum is as a big learning algorithm.
I feel like the cerebellum might be an LLM like learning algorithm, right? Because like if it's just trying to learn like exactly how to coordinate muscles, isn't that the kind of thing that the LLM paradigm seems good at?
I don't think you should believe everything you read about the cerebellum. So,
Okay.
so the cerebellum is involved in motor control, but it's also involved in emotions and it's also involved in thinking. And I think the right way to think about the cerebellum is that it is just this big, expensive workaround for the fact that the brain is very slow. So everything in the brain has ridiculously high latency because the signals are being carried around on these axons and not, electronic signals on wires like we're used to with computer chips. If you have all these crazy latencies all over the place, one thing you can do is to set a learning algorithm that just looks at some signal and says, the goal of this learning algorithm, the loss function, is to predict what this signal is going to be doing in, let's say, zero point 0.2 seconds. And so you have a very clear loss function. Just wait zero point 0.2 seconds and you'll see whether your guess was right or wrong. And basically what you're doing is time traveling that signal into the future by zero point 0.2 seconds at the expense of some noise. And that's often a good trade-off.
Okay, this is a lot of this is clicking for me because first of all, you're saying the training, the reward function is just wait 0.2 seconds. Isn't that a lot like when you're training a LLM using unsupervised learning and then its signal can just be the next token?
Yeah, you could think of it as a kind of predictive learning, just as LLMs are doing predictive learning.
Okay, well, I gotta believe this is true because cerebellum, the last three letters are almost LLM. So I really want to think of the cerebellum as like the LLM part of the brain.
Yeah, I love it.
Kidding aside, it is. I am seeing a lot of connections here because you and I both agree that the brain is probably architecturally more than an LLM. But it also seems to me like there's this big turbo supercharger to the LLM. Right? Like maybe a good analogy is like think about like rendering graphics. It's probably useful to have like actual physics simulations, like just in the field of computer graphics. We probably don't want to throw away actual ray tracing, actual physics simulations. But it seems like maybe the physics simulator maybe can just render like 1 frame per second, and then the LLM layer can like hallucinate the next second. That seems to me like what's going on with the human brain, where we've got the parts that are like smarter and use a different architecture, but then we also interpolate the hell out of it using the cerebellum or whatever.
So an important thing to know about the cerebellum is that there's sometimes people born without a cerebellum and they turn out
Hmm.
okay. They walk a little
Wow.
funny, I think. They're maybe they're not the next Einstein, but they can hold down a job and live independently. They're really the cerebellum in the context of a human isn't. I really don't think that we need to be thinking about it. I don't think it's doing anything important. I do think the cortex also does predictive learning, and I think that predictive learning in general is a very useful thing to do. And that's why the AI people invented it, or I guess reinvented it. And that's why evolution also uses it all over the place.
Do you know what's the problem with the people who are born without the cerebellum? Because I've heard it's hard for them to coordinate their movements, right? Which to me maps to the idea of like it's like a video where you're only getting 1 keyframe per second, right? So that it's just kind of jerky, right? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. If in terms of this latency hypothesis that I advocate, you would think of it as like you need a lot of online feedback in motor control. So, every fraction of a second, you're noticing that your foot is just a little bit to the left of where it ought to be to, or, the floor is just a little bit higher. So you need to dynamically
Hmm.
adjust. And if there's this giant lag between, you have to send a signal all the way down to your foot. And meanwhile, your proprioceptive signals take a while to get all the way back up to your brain. You're just going to have a heck of a time doing that kind of motor control adjustment with such big time lags.
Okay, so I think where this is going is like, I personally feel kind of convinced that what we've done with deep learning and with LLMs, I think that we've put our finger on like a big thing that the brain is doing. And I know you think, which I agree with, that it's not all of what the brain is doing. But do you agree with me that it's like a big part of what the brain is doing?
I'm just going to give the Weasley answer saying that LLMs are like brains in some respects and unlike them in other respects. And I agree that the predictive learning aspect of LLMs is also something that brains do.
Right. Specifically, it seems like the cerebellum, right? I don't know. I'm obsessed with this concept, but it seems like a pretty close analogy to me.
Again, the cortex also has predictive learning.
Okay, fair enough. And the other reason why I am thinking that LLMs really are like the real secret sauce, not all of it, but like I think that we have actually nailed half or whatever, some fraction of the actual secret sauce that the brain uses, just because this idea of these high dimensional vectors, it just makes so much sense. Or it's just like, it's just so easy that you can just have a high dimensional vector and that will just encode the semantic meaning of something in like a subtle way and like the relationship to other vectors. Like, yep, just linear operations. A lot of the true meaning of words is just like their coordinates in this high dimensional space. It just seems like that's got to be out of God's book. Like why wouldn't the brain do that if it's so powerful and so simple?
Yeah, maybe the brain does do that.
All right. I guess that's as far as you'll go. That's fine. All right. So just to summarize again, so the cerebellum is like it's really good at prediction, but like you don't really need it. So like if you want to have 150 IQ, it's probably not because your cerebellum is contributing that much. It's probably more your cerebrum, and your cerebrum is 80% of the brain's volume. So like when you think about a brain visually, I guess you're mostly thinking about like the outside of the brain with all of those folds, and you're thinking about like the outer layers, which are like folded cerebrum, correct?
Yeah, so the cerebrum, I think, is a little bit broader than the cortex. And so the cortex is the the part that I spend most of my time talking about. And it includes the hippocampus, which is 3 layers, and it includes the neocortex, which is mostly 5 or 6 layers. And it's this wrinkly thing. If you unfolded it, it would be about the size of a dinner napkin. It's really contorted to get it to fit in the human skull. But it's this sort of thin sheet. And then there's all this like white matter, which is how the cortex connects to itself and to other parts of the brain.
And just help deconfuse me here. So cerebrum versus cortex versus neocortex. One more time.
Cerebrum is a broader term that also includes some other things outside of the cortex. I think it also includes the striatum, which I think is a separate learning from scratch system. And then it also, I think, includes the pallidum, which I think actually should be lumped in with the hypothalamus and brainstem as part of the repository of yet more business logic. The divisions of like, what are the different types of cells and, how do they look structurally? When you start looking at that, then you find that the whole cortex looks pretty similar to the rest of the cortex, leaving aside the allocortex versus isocortex and other finer distinctions. And the whole striatum kind of looks the same. So that includes the caudate, the putamen, the nucleus accumbens, lateral septum, this and that. But it all includes sort of the same type of neurons connected in kind of the same way, with some interesting exceptions that we can get into. So I think the cortex is a big learning algorithm, and then the striatum is a different, somewhat less big learning algorithm that's like interconnected with the first one.
And you said cortex is neocortex plus striatum, or what's neocortex again?
Neocortex is a term that means like the part that was new in mammals. So basically, if you go back to our common ancestor with like lizards, the amniotes had, it's believed, 100% 3-layer cortex, which is called allocortex. So we still have some 3-layer cortex, including the hippocampus, which is famous for navigation and memory, and the piriform cortex, which is involved in smell. But then we also got this big part of our cortex, now most of it, like 90+% probably, that's 6 layers. So presumably it does something more complicated. I still think it's a big learning algorithm, but it's a more complicated one. And it's called neocortex because it evolved in mammals.
It reminds me of the Gillette razors, right? You just have more layers in your cortex, 4 blades on your razor. You can learn better.
And the human visual cortex has like sub layers for all of the layers. So if you actually count, you'd get up to like 9-10 layers or something.
Amazing. Okay. All right. Now, talking about business logic, you wrote in one of your posts that understanding this tangle of business logic, meaning in the steering brain, meaning the hypothalamus and brainstem, understanding this tangle of business logic is annoying but possible. And then you did an exercise, you challenged yourself to go and understand laughter because you think that laughter is totally business logic.
That's right. I think I have this post on laughter where I propose a certain connection, a hypothesized cell group in the hypothalamus, and what would be its inputs and what would be its outputs. And I argue that if the cell group exists, then it would explain everything about our everyday experience of laughter. It would be evolutionarily plausible. It would agree with like how we observe laughter in chimps and in mice. Yeah, if you tickle a mouse, it actually laughs. It's ultrasonic. You need a special equipment to hear it. But people do tickle mice, and that it's neuroscientifically plausible. I don't think anyone has measured this particular hypothalamus cell group, if it exists, but it's an experiment that somebody could do. I hope that somebody does it at some point. It would be pretty cool.
Right. And it's a special case of what you're trying to do, which is basically reverse engineer all this business logic, because basically what you're saying is like, yeah, there's a lot of parameters. It's not going to be like one line of code. It's not going to be a simple instruction. Maybe it'll have like thousands of instructions, but like somebody should just try to read out just all of this low level assembly language business logic.
Yeah, I think that would be a fruitful and helpful thing. I hope people work on it. So there's like a lot of people who do this sort of artisanally, where they are measuring one cell group at a time. I guess you would call it tracer studies in this case. So they measure what are the inputs to the cell group, what are the outputs. They measure like what genes are expressed. They often do optogenetic things where they turn the cell group on and off and see how it correlates with behavior. And those are really gold standard. You can learn a whole lot from those studies. I would take one study like that over 100 fMRI studies in terms of learning things about the brain. And meanwhile, there's also groups that are trying to do connectomics at a large scale. You're not doing, you know, probing each group one at a time and correlating it with behavior, but rather you're taking some entire brain and trying to measure how everything connects to everything in this big giant data set. So there's a number of groups, especially E11 is one of them that are doing connectomics, and it's this exciting area. I very much wish them luck. Whenever I talk to machine learning people, I tell them that there's cool connectomics jobs because you have to do all this really tricky image reconstruction stuff.
Let's talk about language acquisition. I think if you go back to like the 1970s and 80s, Noam Chomsky was famous for basically saying, look, language is innate business logic, right? Things like it has a structured grammar that's just like hardwired in your genes. And you just have this brain that just already from birth knows what to look for in grammar. But I also think today it seems like there's plenty of online learning happening too. I mean, certainly we all, the dictionary is obviously learned, right? So what's your view on language acquisition?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the language areas of the neocortex, they look pretty similar to all the other areas of the neocortex. I do think there's a little bit of business logic involved. In particular, the part that says that if you hear a human voice, then you should pay attention to it. Um, and also the part that says you should try talking. Without those, people might not be motivated to acquire language. So motivation kind of has to come from,
Hmm.
there's no, God doesn't tell you what's interesting and what's uninteresting. If people are motivated to count the pebbles on the sidewalk, then they could do that all day and learn a lot about pebbles. But humans, especially human babies, tend to pay attention to other people. What are people saying? What are people doing? And I think that is related to motivation, and that has to come from the hypothalamus and brainstem. And I have ideas about exactly how that works.
If you look at the LLMs that can talk to us now, right? It's like the Richard Sutton bitter lesson came into play big time, right? The fact that these just trained on the next word and they didn't explicitly train on like the rules of grammar, although technically I guess they did go and read Strunk and White or whatever as part of their training. But I think, just by reading the next, it doesn't seem like the Strunk and White or the grammar textbooks are how they learned grammar. It seems like they really just learned it using like a general learning algorithm. So that is a pretty big signal that Chomsky was kind of wrong about like the amount of hard-coded business logic. Like it's more online learning. And if you think about the evolutionary explanation, I think it stands to reason that the genes are trying to be efficient and our genes are trying to offload as much as possible into the generic learning algorithm and only hard code the smallest possible bits just because it's hard for natural selection to keep up the integrity of these bits. Is that right?
Once we start talking about learning algorithms, I would shift the discussion from business logic to inductive biases. And I do think there
Mm-hmm.
is some evidence that the inductive bias of the cortex is different from the inductive bias of a language model. For example, if I understand correctly, babies will make language mistakes that LLMs in training do not make, like overgeneralizing grammar rules and stuff like that. I only heard this secondhand, so don't quote me on that. But clearly, the success of large language models at doing language is evidence that it is at least possible for a large scale learning algorithm to acquire language. And I think that's some like indirect evidence that likewise the cortex could be a big learning algorithm that acquires language amongst all the other things that it's able to do, like motor control, reasoning, and so on. Some people talk about a language is special because it has recursion or something. But if you look at a picture in a picture, that's vision, but it has recursion. If you talk about making a plan that has a subplan, that's planning, but that has recursion too. Music can have recursion. All these things can have recursion. I think that's not something special about language. It's just something that is
Yeah.
that's in the space of things that this learning algorithm is capable of doing.
Which is pretty incredible, right? I mean, it certainly wasn't my intuition. If you'd asked me like 10 years ago, do you think this kind of like deep learning algorithm can handle a lot of recursion? I'd be like, I don't know, man. I feel like recursion, you really need to like program in the structure. But as you say, right, it can chomp through a big text that has like a lot of recursive grammatical structures in it or like self-referential context. And like, it's not really a problem. Like, as long as you don't go like 100 recursive levels deep, which nobody does, it just seems fine. I mean, isn't that a little surprising that it can handle recursion?
Yeah, humans can't go 100 recursive levels deep either,
Right, exactly,
obviously.
exactly.
Yeah, LLMs are very impressive. They're definitely able to follow recursive structures.
On this show, it's a common question that I ask my guests, like, okay, you think that AGI isn't coming soon because you think LLMs are limited, but like, what's actually the barrier? And I get such a wide range of answers. Some people are like, well, LLMs don't have agency. They're all ultimately controlled by a human. I'm like, I don't know, man. If you put them in a loop, they seem pretty agentic to me. If they just keep deciding the next thing to do. So like that's like a weak example. And I just did a reaction episode to an interview with Amjad Masad, and Amjad Masad was saying, well, they don't think about novel concepts. They can only remix. And I'm like, well, if you just keep like remixing and then you like remix your remixes, can't you like make novelty that way? So I'm never convinced by these answers, but you are at the forefront of convincing me of what the limitation of an LLM might be. I had Dr. Andrew Critch on the show, and he was very explicitly on the stance of like, there's no barrier. Like you just keep scaling up LLMs, like everything is just going to fall. Like maybe there will be small barriers, but I don't see a big barrier. But it does seem like you see a barrier because when you look at the human brain, you can not write off, but you can classify parts as being like just LLM like parts. My interpretation is the cerebellum is very LLM like, but in your mind, there's like some parts of the human brain that are doing some other smart thing, which is very powerful, which LLMs are just never going to get to, right? Like you see some sort of barrier.
Uh, I should start with a caveat that I'm usually not very enthusiastic about the enterprise of arguing people out of their belief that LLMs will scale to AGI. And if I'm talking to an alignment researcher who's preparing for the contingency that maybe LLMs will scale to AGI, then I'm like, okay, that seems like a kind of reasonable thing to do. I mean, I'm not so confident that, like, I don't want to, I want to grow this field of like non-LLM AGI safety, but I don't want to do that by parasitizing from the already pathetically small field of LLM AGI safety. I'd rather bring new people into the field. But you asked the question, and yeah, I do think that LLMs will stall out before they get terribly powerful and dangerous. I mean, they'll be dangerous in like some sort of more minor ways, but not dangerous in the like robot armies wiping out humanity kind of way, or inventing plagues and so on. LLMs are already on the verge of mass spearfishing, which would be bad. LLMs are already on the verge of like virtual friends that are like social media meets fentanyl, but way worse. Like all these things are bad enough without the robot armies and plagues wiping out humanity. But if we're just talking about the actual like taking over the world and wiping out humanity, then yeah, I don't think LLMs are going to do that. Not now, not ever, not with reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards, not with scaffolding. I do think that they're missing some stuff.
Well, that's certainly good news, and that certainly advises why you're not super worried about AI takeover in the next 2 years,
Yeah.
because you think there is another paradigm shift coming. And of course, it might come in like 5 years. It sounds like you wouldn't be that surprised if it comes in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I certainly wouldn't rule out as soon as 5 years, just because a lot can happen in 5 years. I like to
Okay.
remind people that 5 years got us from, uh, you know, LLMs did not exist at all to 2023, where, there was already like billions of dollars going into them. Tens of thousands of hours had been poured into LLMs between 2018 when they didn't exist at all and 2023. So that's 5 years. And yeah, a lot can happen in 5 years.
Right. As one example, 5 years is a time where back 5 years ago, everybody's like, well, Google stopped working. I used to be able to type these long queries and get these useful resources. And now it's just like a page of spam. Like Google doesn't work anymore. Whereas today, if you ask me, what do I think of web search? Sure, maybe I don't raw dog Google. I don't type my query into Google. But when I type my query into something like GPT-03, or to be fair, Google's AI mode, I type my query into something like that, and I get a better quality search than I ever dreamed of. Because what happens is it spends the next minute running a bunch of adaptive search queries and reasoning and reading the web pages for me and synthesizing everything. I've never dreamed that search could work that well. So we went from Google stopped working to, oh my God, does it work?
Yeah, a lot can happen in 5 years. There's also the anecdote where one of the Wright brothers said that he was 50 years away from flight and then he achieved it
Mhm.
2 years later.
Exactly, exactly. All right, so I have some follow-ups, but let me go back real quick just to your model still. of the two brain subsystems, I just want to poke at that a little bit more. Let's take a simple goal like relieve my itch. Like, oh, I got an itch on my arm. I want to relieve my itch. So do I have to use my steering brain to do it? Or can my learning brain just learn, can the cerebellum just be like, oh yeah, I know the pattern here. You just move your hand.
I think scratching itches is a motivated behavior, a sort of motivated, flexible behavior that goes through the learning within lifetime learning. Basically, the story would be that there would be some part of the brainstem, I don't know, the nucleus of the solitary tract or something. I don't remember exactly is what's responsible for itches, but so that sends a number of signals. So that gets ground truth from the body, certain type of, nerve cell that goes through the spinal cord, dorsal horn or something. And then it would send a number of signals to different places in the learning subsystem. So one thing it would do is send an interoceptive sensory input. So we would feel a particular type of feeling that we would describe as an itch. And another thing it would do is send what I call involuntary attention. And that makes it hard to think about anything else except for the itch. So we want to be thinking about math homework, but our attentional pathways have been hijacked by this hypothalamus or brainstem cell group, and it forces us to be thinking about the sensation of itchiness. And then yet a third thing would be going to the sort of like the reward function of our reinforcement learning system and saying this feeling of the itch is bad. And when we scratch the itch and we feel that feeling of relief, that's a good thing. So when you put all those ingredients together, it becomes very easy for the little baby to learn that scratching an itch is good. And thus the baby does so.
So that all makes sense. Is it possible that it's all a short circuit around the steering brain? Like we don't need a lot of business logic for that?
I don't think there's too much happening in the steering brain. I just think it's this little cell group with like one input and three outputs or four outputs or something.
And so, I mean, this is the distinction that I want to dive into, right? Because I think that the steering brain, you would argue, is really not analogous to LLMs, and it's still part of the like human only, right? No AI is allowed, human only secret sauce. And yet we can see that, some behavior like scratching an itch seems to route around it. And I guess the question is just like, how much can LLMs do things like, how much can you scale up scratching an itch, right? What if the itch is like conquer the world?
So I think we should think of the steering subsystem as a little bit like a reinforcement learning reward function. It does other things too, but it controls your heart rate. But if we think of it as mainly being a reinforcement learning reward function, then that would be a little bit analogous to the RLHF reward function in LLM land or to the RLVR reward function. And so like people do reinforcement learning with LLMs. I don't think that's like the secret sauce is to have some special reward function.
Yeah, so I'm trying to poke at your distinction between the two types of brains because I'm trying to think what is kind of like the minimal level of challenge, the minimal complexity of a goal, where you can't just have these circuits that get wired up online using reinforcement learning. Like the steering system really has to come into play. I think you've used the example of long-term goals like make a profitable business. Like you definitely have to use a steering system for that. You can't just rely on a loop. And I guess because time is just way too long.
So when I think about one of the things that large language models are not great at, I think they kind of struggle when you put a lot of interconnected complexity into the context window that is not already on the internet. And the more interconnected layered complexity you pile into the complex context window, the worse the LLM does. If you imagine training some LLM where you purge every mention of linear algebra from the training data, and then you put a linear algebra textbook into the context window, and it has all of these new concepts. So it has, bases and kernels and singular value decomposition and inversion and a matrix exponentials and a gajillion other things that all relate to each other and pile on top of each other. And then you ask the LLM to do the exercises. I think it would do a terrible job just because the context window is just because it's not good at that kind of thing. It needs to learn things into its weights to have decent performance. So that's kind of a contrived example. But if you think of like running a factory, you likewise, over the course of time, wind up with idiosyncratic complexity and domain knowledge that's not on the internet. So I know that this machine is good for this and bad for this, and how it interconnects to this other machine, and how it interconnects to like the noise regulations in the town, and what my different employees are good at and bad at, and the things that I've tried, and everything about my suppliers and everything about my customers. Too much complexity in the context window, and the LLM starts to fall apart. And that also kind of explains why LLMs are so good at self-contained problems compared to getting hired as a complete drop-in replacement human employee, which they are basically not doing much yet.
Yep.
Yeah, that's sort of how I think about at least one aspect of LLM limitations.
Gotcha. I also want to ask about animal brains. Do some animals excel at one type of brain or the other? Like, is there some animal that's not human that just happens to have a really good steering brain the same way we do?
There's definitely variation in the animal kingdom about how much of their behavior comes from flexible within lifetime learning versus how much of their behavioral repertoire comes from the steering subsystem. It's not just variation across the animal kingdom, but also a variation within your lifetime. For example, a newborn is almost entirely brainstem driven in its behavior, whereas an adult has very, very little of that comparatively. We still have our flinch reflexes, we still, swallow, we still vomit, we still have vasoconstriction. But by and large, most of the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis are learned. And if you compare that with like a frog where, its entire cerebrum part of its brain is, I think, 25% of its brain volume, as opposed to like 80% for us, it's going to be doing a lot more instinctive behavior throughout its life. So presumably, I've seen newborn babies. They're, with all great respect, they're not very impressive in their ability to navigate the world because humans have evolved to be so reliant on these learned behaviors. And the animals, presumably, that do less within lifetime learning are going to be correspondingly better at navigating through innate reflexes.
Do you think it's accurate to say that a lot of animals do have comparable steering departments in terms of like brainstem and hypothalamus, but at the end of the day, they just can't learn that much, and so their steering options are limited?
It's hard to compare. Frogs have the right instincts for being a frog, and we have the right instincts for being a human. And part of that is that, yeah, our steering subsystem is doing stuff that will help guide the learning subsystem to learn useful things. And if you don't learn as much within a lifetime, then that's less for the steering subsystem to do. And it makes up for that by having more to do on the sort of motor control side. I don't want to build some hierarchy about, whose reflexes are better or worse. Every animal has reflexes that are very impressive and help it survive and thrive in its own niche.
It seems like it's kind of obvious to look at humans versus other animals and say that we have a much bigger neocortex, which gives us a much bigger learning brain. And so we learn better than the other animals, and we can like learn more complex things than the other animals. I feel like that's kind of like a consensus account. And then you would also agree with that account, or what's like an interesting piece of nuance there?
I don't have a strong take on the secret sauce of human brains as compared to, I don't know, elephant brains, which have a comparable amount of neocortex, I guess. Or I don't know exactly how the cell counts compare, but maybe the cell types are different, or yeah, I don't really have much of a take on that.
Right. Yeah, that's where I was going with that too, because there's some animals, I think you said elephants, where like the amount of neurons and neural interconnections like per unit of their body mass or whatever, I think might even exceed humans, or are we like clearly number one?
I don't know. And I'm not even sure that, you want to divide by body mass. Like you do want to divide by body mass for some things. Motor control might scale with body area. Certainly you need a bigger and better cerebellum if you have, longer nerves that have more latency that needs to be corrected. If we don't divide by body mass, then you start talking about, whales and stuff. Blue whales are just ridiculously enormous, so I imagine that their brains are bigger than humans, but I haven't checked.
All right, so I've got the results from GPT-03. It's saying below are the best measured front runners in terms of total number of neurons and most neurons per kilogram of body mass. So total number of neurons, the winner is African savanna elephant with 257 billion neurons, followed by the killer whale, aka the orca, with like 43 billion of cortex-only neurons. Okay, so we're down from 257 to 43. Geez, that elephant definitely has a surplus of neurons here. But it says it's mainly from a gigantic cerebellum. Okay, and we think cerebellum neurons are like less impressive in terms of like, I don't know, the kind of intelligent, their cerebellum is bad at book smarts, right?
Yeah, I think that's that you see the bigger cerebellum, that it's probably related to motor control, related to these very, very long nerves
Ah,
that induce really severe delays, time delays. You want to be trying to like correct for those time delays with the cerebellum, according to sort of how I think about it.
gotcha, gotcha. Okay. And then in terms of most neurons per kilogram of body mass, apparently number one is a species called Anna's hummingbird because it only has 4.5 grams of body mass. So each neuron is really going to count. And it packs in 450 million neurons.
Yeah, birds, obviously need to fly, so every evolution has been working very hard to make them lighter.
Okay. So let's just state the obvious. I think you and I are both on the same page that it's not like some non human animals are secretly so smart in a way that we can't imagine. Like, it's pretty obvious that humans are the smartest, right?
Um, uh, it's possible that
Okay.
uh,
You
I,
hesitated longer than I
I
thought.
want to say something more nuanced, like
Okay.
I'm sure there's things that chimpanzees are better at than humans, and likewise elephants. I do think that there's an important fact related to the fact that humans invented technology and went to the moon, and elephants did not, and orcas did not. And the same thing that humans did by inventing, we colonized every continent on Earth, and we clearly are able to use technology to accomplish goals in a way that other animals are not. And the thing that humans are doing that enables them to do that is something that future AI will be able to do too. So that's kind of like what's relevant to my own interests.
Exactly. Same here. The steering brain, we're talking about the brainstem and the hypothalamus. I think it's an interesting contrast to look at what Google is telling me about these brain regions by citing Cleveland Clinic, and then to look at your interpretation. So, for example, when I search for hypothalamus, Google is highlighting that the hypothalamus helps manage your body temperature, hunger and thirst, mood, sex drive, blood pressure, and sleep. But in your mind, it's maybe doing more than that in terms of like steering the human's goals.
Yeah, it's doing all those things and more. There's definitely strong evidence that social instincts are also one of the things in the hypothalamus, which goes beyond, sex drive and aggression, but also includes things like parenting. There was a recent study that found that mice get lonely and they long for the comforting touch of another mouse, you know, and the lonelier they get, the more comforted they are when they finally get to hang out with a new mouse friend. And they found a little cell group in the hypothalamus that tracks how long it's been since the mouse has been with another mouse. And it's over the course of days, its activity ramps up and up and up. And then once they get caressed by another mouse friend, this different cell group, turns it back off. So that's the hypothalamus doing something that's, very obviously related to sociality. So humans have this, I guess we humans have this sort of sense that like our morality and our sense of justice and all these things are like, given to us by God in our immortal soul. People might describe it more sophisticated than that, but we don't like to think that these quote unquote higher instincts are, you know, just another cell group next to the one that controls your blood pressure. But really, I think there's good evidence that it is just another cell group next to the one that controls your blood pressure, out in the medial preoptic nucleus or whatever of the hypothalamus. That's what it is for mice. That's sort of what makes sense in terms of AI and in terms of, you can't get an ought from an is. If we want to follow
Right,
human
right, right.
norms, there has to be some motivation coming from our brainstem and hypothalamus that says it's good to follow norms and it's bad to violate norms. And there has to be some cell group implementing that.
Exactly. So if you're correct that what we think of as morality is business logic that our genes write into our hypothalamus or that region somewhere, in that case, we certainly believe in the orthogonality thesis, where it's easy for us to imagine, okay, well, imagine changing the genes, imagine changing the business logic, then you change morality, at least with respect to the new organism, right? You and I might agree, no, killing people is wrong no matter what, but the new organism will disagree and there may not be anybody to stop him.
High functioning psychopaths actually exist in the human world. We like to pretend that they don't, but they really do. And I think we can learn something from the fact that they exist.
Exactly. So from my perspective, it's like, what else is there to say, right? This is so obvious. And yet half the guests come on this program and we have to debate whether morality is universal or whether the orthogonality thesis is true.
Yeah, I'm definitely very strongly on the side of you can't get an ought from an is. I think that the oughts come directly or indirectly from this reward function, and the ises come from the cortex learning, using predictive learning to build a better and better model of the world.
Yep. Okay. So we did hypothalamus. Now I'm looking at clevelandclinic.org for the brainstem. It says brainstem helps regulate vital body functions that you don't have to think about, like breathing and your heart rate. Your brainstem also helps with your balance, coordination, and reflexes.
Yeah, there's often a sort of hierarchy where the hypothalamus is kind of deciding what reflex programs to do. It's deciding whether it's a good time to laugh. And if it is a good time to laugh, then the hypothalamus will trigger various cell groups in the brainstem that actually coordinate which muscles are going on in which order. Or, the hypothalamus will say, this is a good time to vomit. And then the brainstem will actually, trigger the vomiting reflex.
Right.
First it's this muscle and then it's that muscle.
And you're saying that there's like a connection between like regulating homeostasis and like keeping all your organs in line and like having goals. I mean, I feel like that's like a pretty key insight that you're bringing here.
Yeah, I mean, vomiting is bad. So obviously, if people don't like vomiting, it's a sign that the vomiting reflex in the hypothalamus is also wired up to this reward function, which says bad thing is happening right now. And then you learn from experience that if you're making a foresighted plan that ends in vomiting, then that's, other things equal a reason not to do that, with apologies to the college students listening in.
Yeah, let me take a stab at explaining, basically repeating what you just said in my own words of like why the brainstem, which Cleveland Clinic is just telling me is about, regulating breathing and heart rate, and coordination and reflexes, compared to you being like, well, this is the part of the brain that does steering, the hard-coded business logic. Maybe you could think about it like this. So when we're about to make a decision, we kind of do a gut check, right? We say like, does this feel right to me? And that's when the part of your brain comes online that's like, okay, let me make your stomach feel worse, right? Let me regulate your stomach, or like predict that your body is going to feel worse if this thing were to play out. And that's like the signal back to your gut check being like, okay, yeah, I'm going to decide this. And that's how it does steering.
Well, that is the thing. The thing you're talking about has a lot of overlap with what's called the somatic marker hypothesis. I do think there's a kernel of truth there, but it could also just be that, some idea pops into my head. Like, what if I take all the cash out of my wallet and shred it? And then that idea seems bad, so I don't do it. And I don't even really think about it for more than a fraction of a second. It doesn't, some bad ideas are like aversive in a way that's connected to physiological arousal and other bodily reactions. But some things, what if I divide both sides of the equation by 3 and then I sort of run through it and it doesn't work. So then I say, oh, okay, I guess I shouldn't do that. It doesn't necessarily have to have much of a connection to anything besides the reward function itself and the sort of related parts of the brain. So from my view, I should also add that I think if we're talking about the brainstem, the part of the brainstem that I care especially about, like, I don't really care which muscles are contracted in which order to cause you to vomit, but I do care a lot about some of the sensory processing systems in the brainstem. So these are a often forgotten part of neuroscience, because if people talk about human vision, they're talking about the fact that the cortex processes vision, but it's a underappreciated fact that the brainstem also processes the same visual data. So the data goes up to the cortex, and in a parallel pathway, it goes down to the superior colliculus in the brainstem, where it's processed, and the brainstem looks for certain triggers. It looks for something that's slithering like a snake or skittering like a spider. It looks for, signs of a beautiful landscape scene or a human face, and it triggers various reactions that are tied to those innate stimuli. And likewise, smell is processed in the cortex, but also in the brainstem. Taste is processed in the cortex, but also in the brainstem. So I think
Mhm.
those areas are very important for the reward function part of the story and ultimately human motivations.
I'm curious to do another example of a time when you're just thinking about something hypothetically, right? So there's not that much sensory input involved. You're just like trying to plan different things you could do. Like, let's say I'm trying to think of a strategic plan for my company, like Elon Musk thinking about what kind of engine is going to be the best to ultimately get us to Mars. What kind of engine design? Should we simplify the engine, or what kind of fuel should we use? What kind of steel should we build it out of? So he's having these abstract strategic planning sessions with himself. And from your perspective, it's not going to be solved by just the LLM type, those kind of like short circuits of like just use reinforcement learning. Like there's some other layer comes into play, some steering system, and it's going to be like the brainstem and hypothalamus somehow doing it, right? Like maybe you can make that connection clearer, because it would be great if you're like, yeah, and then they go and do something that the Cleveland Clinic would have described as like regulating homeostasis, but they like somehow put their hand on the steering wheel.
Yeah, I feel like you've gotten an impression that I think the real difference between the human brain like AGI and LLMs is that the human brain has a cooler reward function, but that's not what I think. I think the cortex is a better learning algorithm than a transformer that's able to do things that transformers can't do. It has a better inductive bias in whatever relevant senses. That's where I think the big difference is. So if we go back to Elon Musk, I don't I don't know what's driving him in the past, certainly not today. But, if he's motivated to build a better rocket, then like why is he motivated? I don't know. He must be motivated for some reason, but it's hard to know exactly what the reason is. Like if I say to Elon Musk, like, it's very important that you have, an odd number of $1 bills in your wallet, then he would say, why is that important? And I would say, because you have an even number of bills in your wallet, but it should be odd. And he would say, why should it be odd? Why should I even care about this? Like, we're not going to be getting anywhere. There's something driving Elon to build that rocket ship. And I think that ultimately comes from some kind of innate drive.
Yeah, but let's separate out that question of like the core motivation or the innate drive, and let's just look at the drive to solve instrumental sub goals, right? It's like whatever Elon's true motivation is, he currently has an instrumental sub goal where he just wants the right engine that's most likely to get us to Mars. And I'm just curious how to model the brain, even thinking strategically about that sub goal in a way that maybe you think LLMs will never be able to do, right? Or like there's some interesting thing the brain is doing just to help him think strategically better than LLMs.
I think the real difference is that brains are just better at doing RL than existing AI algorithms today. So RL algorithms, like there's a lot of things so for example, if I go to a yummy restaurant, then I want to go back to it. And I don't need to, you know, go to the restaurant over and over and over and over again and in this episodic way. And the way that an RL algorithm, as we think of it today, would have to do. Instead, I can just want to go to the restaurant after eating their yummy food just once and make flexible, foresighted plans towards doing that. So it's like, I think it's pretty clear that the human model-based RL system is just more effective at doing model-based RL, at having a model and getting
Yeah.
rewards on the basis of that model with planning than any existing algorithm, whether LLMs, whether AlphaZero or Mu0 type things, than what the AI research community has produced today.
I think I get what you're saying. So in the example of Elon strategizing the best engine design, given that his instrumental sub goal is to get to Mars efficiently, in that example, you're not claiming that the brainstem and the hypothalamus are contributing much to that piece of work.
Yeah, I don't think they are. I think it's all comes from the fact that the reinforcement learning, the model building, the world modeling, the ability to continue to learn new things as you go. I think that's all working better for humans than it would work for LLMs. I think if you tried to set an LLM with a similar goal, it would kind of be starting to do the right thing, but as time goes on and its context window piles up with all the idiosyncratic details of its, plan for the rocket engine and what it has it tried before and what didn't work and what did work and why didn't it work, it would eventually sort of lose track of what's going on. And that's ultimately the problem. It's on the learning algorithm level, not the motivation level.
So this general sophisticated behavior of like having instrumental goals and then going out to achieve them, do you think that's almost all online learned, like flexibly learned? Because it is kind of one thing, right, that every agent would want to learn.
I don't think it's fundamentally different from what LLMs can already do. Like if you ask an LLM to make a plan to do X, then it's going to notice obvious instrumental subgoals. So I don't think there's anything special there. I think the issue is that if the plan becomes sufficiently complicated, then the LLM eventually starts flailing around and gets confused about what it's doing.
Okay, yeah. So just to recap, you think a lot about the brain steering because even somebody like Elon Musk, who spends a lot of his time just figuring out instrumental goals, right? Just head in the weeds, just instrumentally trying to optimize a design or whatever. There's also a lot of times when he pulls his head out of the weeds and he's like, okay, but what's my ultimate goal, right? And that's where you think he does do the gut check with the brainstem or whatever, and that's the part that we want to understand.
Yeah, there's some reason that Elon is doing whatever he does, or that any company founders or anyone in the world who's doing a complicated project is doing that project. There's a reason that they started it. They might be thinking of it, constantly. Like I don't know, if I'm walking upstairs to get a sweater, that I'm probably like imagining the sweater in my mind's eye as I walk up the stairs, and that's keeping me going. It's not like I really like walking upstairs for its own sake. But it's also possible that, like, once I get going, walking up enough steps, I can sort of forget about the sweater transiently and just know that I'm doing something good. And then when I get upstairs, I'll remember, I know why I came upstairs, because I wanted that sweater. But the sweater is why I started. The sweater is kind of what's keeping me going. If I got really depressed and everything sort of lost its motivation, then I would also stop walking up the stairs at the same time. Like if somebody injected some drug in me that induced severe clinical depression, then I would immediately stop doing whatever I was doing.
Hmm. You wrote a really long sequence on what you call brain-like AGI.
Yes.
When I hear you talk when I hear you talk about brain-like AGI, I feel like you would have wanted to just say AGI, but now that we have these LLMs, and LLMs are like these weak AGIs that are weaker than we thought AGIs were going to be, now we need a more precise term for the AGIs that are going to like fulfill the true destiny of AGI. So you call them brain-like AGIs.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly wanted to be agnostic. You could imagine that there's more than one way to build AGI. I mean, in principle, if cost is no barrier, there's definitely more than one way to build AGI. Like you can, whatever, do a blind search over all computer programs and you'll eventually get AGI that way. You can,
Mhm.
computable approximations to Solomon-Off induction eventually will come upon AGI. So I was saying this is a contingency that we should plan for. This is like one way that an AGI computer program can look.
It's a lower bound on true AGI as being brain-like.
It's a scenario, and I do actually think
Mhm.
it's the most likely scenario, and maybe the only plausible scenario, but I didn't want to I mean, it's hard to argue for that.
And it's also possible that every AGI is kind of brain-like. I mean, we don't even know.
Yeah, I would put that another way and say that it's possible that brain-like AGI is like the only, or at least in the sort of broad sense that I use the term, is the only practical way to build AGI. I like to bring out the fast Fourier transform case. Like if you're going to do a Fourier transform on a large data set, you should use FFT. And FFT kept getting reinvented over and over through the course of history because that's just the best way to do FFT. And if we ever met aliens, then they would be doing FFT too. That's just like the natural algorithm for solving this problem. So by the same token,
Mhm.
it's possible that like the natural algorithm for, getting ambitious projects done in the real world is brain-like AGI. We don't know that for sure. It's just sort of a possibility.
One observation about brain like AGI that I think is pretty important is that it seems like evolution had a pretty easy time building human brains just because I'm observing the brain size difference and the intelligence difference between other apes and humans. It happened really fast in evolutionary time. So it's not like natural selection had to like refine it over so many eons. It's like, oh yeah, just add more neurons and then you could be really intelligent, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to tell. You could point to evidence in the other direction too, like the fact that we didn't have technological species for the last 500 million years of vertebrates. And, why didn't elephants and orcas, you know, invent technology? I don't know. and how many different pieces of the puzzle got happen to already be in our brain, to seed the way for human-like intelligence. It's just, yeah, it's a little hard to, I wouldn't say that there's a clear-cut answer.
Well, if you don't want to agree that it was easy to build intelligence, then the only other thing you can claim is that other apes already have most of the intelligence that humans have. But then there's the observation of like, okay, but we're the boss, not them, right? Like there's a huge difference in terms of like practical, how much we're achieving. So it's just interesting that this last spurt where all the effective power was an evolutionarily easy spurt.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, there's not that much evolution happened between us and chimps.
And that gives me a strong intuition that we really are likely on the eve of AGI. Like whatever that last spurt is going to be, we're probably close.
Um, yeah, I agree with the conclusion. I'm not sure that that's drawing an argument, because reasonable people disagree about how many of the other ingredients are still missing. But I do think you're right that we're gonna get there with sort of like one big missing piece.
Let's go back to that question and the question of what can't LLMs fundamentally do? People love talking about the subject because it's very interesting, right? We have these LLMs. Everybody has been at least a little bit surprised about how many things they can do. And yet so many people are making so many claims about what they can't do. And like a lot of those claims seem to get disproven. Like there's the famous Scott Alexander versus Gary Marcus and other skeptics, where the skeptics are saying like, look, these images, they're like hallucinated. You're never going to have like a horse riding a person. It's always going to draw a person riding a horse, even if you prompt it to do a horse riding a person. But then like the next version comes out and it successfully draws like a horse piggybacking on a person. So there's like all these back and forth debates about what these LLMs can't do. And the goalposts seem to keep moving. And you've kind of surprised me by, you think you've taken a stand, right, over what LLMs can't do. And you use the example of, you would be shocked, it would totally break your model if you could just have an LLM based system that could create a successful, profitable company.
Well, I mean, there's like these toy examples on the internet where the LLM is like, going like, I'm an LLM, and then Mark Andreessen is like, hey, you're take $10 billion or something, and you could call that a business, but it's kind of like a silly thing. Like if we're talking about like a robust business, Amazon style business where they, build things and they come up with new business models and they actually execute over an extended period of time, and they have management and they have employees, that kind of thing. I think Jeff Bezos is still head and shoulders above LLMs in being able to do that.
Now, when we use metrics like novelty and creativity, there's like a very popular choice of metrics of people trying to argue that like it never strays far from its template, so it can never be novel, it can only remix. Do you think that's a productive metric, or do you think we have to find a different metric?
So there's a thing that humans can do. Like if I say, imagine a purple colander with a bird on top falling out of an airplane, and you can just immediately create that image in your head, and I can ask you follow-up questions about it, and you'll be able to answer those questions very skillfully, leveraging all of your understanding of colanders and aerodynamics and airplanes and birds. Is that like a creative thing that you just did? Maybe. And it's definitely this kind of thing that LLMs can do. It involves, remixing existing ideas in a way that has never happened before, so far as I know. I mean, I don't know. There's like the thing where LLMs fail in really quite baffling ways sometimes. And it's hard to know exactly what to make of LLMs saying things that are like stupid and in a very inhuman and baffling way. I'm sort of more likely to emphasize what I said before about the context window. The more that you pile stuff into the context window, the worse the LLM gets. And the stuff that's not in the context window has to be stuff that humans already created on the internet, more or less.
But when you put it that way, it suggests that maybe there's ways to work around it, being like, okay, well, what if I just use like 2 prompts, right? Where it's like half the stuff in each prompt and then merge them.
Yeah, I'm sure people will try whatever possibilities they can think of. And I just think that this is a problem that's with the LLM architecture.
Another way for me to ask the question about where you think the LLM barrier is let me ask it this way. What do you think is the least impressive thing that AI almost certainly still can't do in 2 years?
I'm reluctant to make a strong stance on this, first of all, because I'm not an LLM power user myself. And second of all, like, I think the yeah, second of all, I'm not asking people to believe me when I say that LLMs will hit a wall. I'm sort of making a research bet, but I'm not like I'm trying not to screw people over in the world where I'm wrong about LLMs hitting a wall. And third of all, like, I do think that so like if so for humans, you can just as a human works on a problem over the course of as they build their factory and run it over the course of days, weeks, months, years, they pile more and more idiosyncratic domain knowledge about this particular factory, knowledge that's not on the internet, into their brain. And LLMs are, I think, unable to do that kind of thing. But what they can do with the context window has been incrementally increasing. I think that I don't want to make a strong stand about exactly where the ceiling is going to be in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I don't exactly disagree with you that LLMs are limited, right? Like, I mean, I can see it too, right? I mean, the most surprising thing to me is that you'll have these state-of-the-art systems that are giving me like such insightful advice about like medical conditions or like analyzing like human relations, like really deeply insightful stuff, like better than humans give, no question. And then you'll ask them like a very simple question, like even some simple arithmetic, and they'll like confidently give you like an obviously wrong answer, right? Like that's still shocking even to this day, right? So I agree there's something up, right? Like there's something to be explained here. Maybe there is some fundamental limitation that has to do with robustness. It's just that like it seems like the model is so flexible, the LLM model is so flexible that like anytime you notice something wrong, a lot of times you can patch it by being like, okay, well, just point them at this giant terabyte of data, and then like the problem will be fixed. And like, really, you just have to point them at a ton of data, and I mean that was pretty easy, right? Now we're talking about like, oh yeah, in the future there will be like a few humans doing something like and pioneering it, and then the AI will like take over rapidly. It's like, huh, okay, so and like you don't think we're that close to automating those humans, to just patching our way to like not even need the humans? I'm just not seeing a hard separation.
So like, if the AI has been running this factory for 6 months and it's so that there isn't any pile of data to point an AI at for all of the details about this particular factory, details that don't exist on the internet, like, this particular way that this particular machine works with this particular set of employees. That's sort of a humdrum example, but of course people are more interested in things like inventing a new scientific paradigm. Like if there's, I don't know, take some random physics concept like quantum capacitance and say that if the LLM doesn't, like, quote unquote understand all the nuances of quantum capacitance, how are you going to create more data for the LLM? Like the way to create data is to understand quantum capacitance. So that's sort of this sort of chicken and egg problem where I don't know where you're supposed to get that data from. I'm sure that the AI companies, as we speak, are trying to solve that puzzle, and I wish them not. I don't wish them luck. I wish them failure, but we'll see how it goes.
So I think the naive proposal for how LLMs could take over the world would be like, okay, yes, of course they need online learning, right? So you do need a loop where like the training is happening constantly, or worst case, maybe you could argue humans do this, right? You go to sleep and you train overnight. I mean, if they want to compete with humans, it's okay if they have 8 hours of downtime per day, right, to retrain themselves. So that's like a pretty generous window. So the naive proposal is you just have better and better LLMs, and they go out into the world and they assemble new knowledge. They've got like a camera attached to them, right? And they're collecting all the data for the day, and then they go to sleep and they train themselves on all the new data, and they wake up and they're just LLMs again. And like, yeah, it's kind of naive. I don't think that's really what AGI is going to be like, but it's very hard for me to tell you where that model is going to tap out relative to humans.
Yeah, I would point to something like, again, if there's some concept that the AI doesn't understand, then it AIs don't have a way to, magic a new training data from thin air. Like if there isn't enough data on quantum capacitance in the
Mhm.
human training corpus, then the AI can't just print out their own new facts about quantum capacitance and train on them, because the whole point is they're confused about quantum capacitance.
Well, I mean, right, but the idea would be that the AI is able, the LLM is able to be employed as a quantum capacitance researcher and do the same daily steps that a human would do to figure it out.
Right. Yeah. So I think that the daily steps that the human does, the humans are still able to do continuous learning in a way that AIs can't. LLMs can't as of
When you
today.
say continuous learning, though, I mean, I'm not sure how long you're talking about, because like the premise would be that the LLM starts the workday with the same amount of background knowledge prior to that day than the human employee would start, right? You take it one day at a time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that humans are able to figure things out in a way that, in the absence of training data, in a way that LLMs can't. If a human realizes that something that they previously believed was wrong, then they can like update their permanent knowledge to excise that incorrect belief. Whereas, at least as of today, the way that LLMs are trained, that kind of thing doesn't happen.
So if I understand correctly, I think you're saying even if you initialize a human and an AI with access to the same prior memories and prior knowledge, and they've read the same textbooks up to the same current state of knowledge, you still think that just in the 8-hour workday, the human researcher has more going on in their brain that's going to let them take the lead versus the LLM.
I think that, yeah, my claim would be that the human is capable of figuring new things out and adding them to its permanent knowledge over the course of the 8-hour workday in a way that the LLM is not, and that you're going to wind up with a slightly smarter human at the end of the workday, and you're not going to wind up with a slightly smarter LLM. And then, maybe over the course of one workday, who cares? But iterate that over days, weeks, months, and the humans can gradually figure things out about their situation over time in a way that I think LLMs can't.
I'm not sure I agree with framing it as the human's so good at adding new things to its knowledge day after day. Just because anytime knowledge is created, LLMs can like vacuum up the knowledge. So I'm not sure that it has to be like accumulation of knowledge that you yourself came up with and then added to the pile. I think it might be more productive. The way I would frame it is to just be more like it's robustness. So it's not just about adding knowledge, it's about like looking over your day and noticing that like a bunch of stuff you did is like bad to learn, right? Or like you made mistakes and you want to backtrack. Because that's my sense of LLMs. It's like they can do everything, but they have this mistake rate and they don't recover from the mistakes, right? The mistakes build up and they don't have like a robust mistake cleaning process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit indirectly related. Again, time will tell what the AI researchers come up with, and certainly
Mhm.
if there's any way to make LLMs work better, then I'm sure that it's already on archive today, and if not today, then tomorrow, and then it'll
Right.
be, in the next generation of LLMs the day after that, and we'll get to see how well it works or doesn't work.
Isn't it weird though that the LMs will make these obvious mistakes, but a lot of times it's like, yeah, they make the mistake like 20% of the time and then they get it right 80% of the time. Isn't it weird that you can't just tell them to run over and over again and like, okay, keep checking your mistake, keep checking your mistake. Like for some reason, like some of these mistakes persist even after a bunch of like check yourself runs.
Yeah, yeah, and is that a problem that, you never know when which kinds of problems are gonna get better in the next generation and which ones are not.
Yeah, okay. So that's what's salient to me is the robustness, and which is like a really weird place to be in. Like I never would have predicted that this could be the situation, but here we are. There's one more thing I wanted to ask you on the subject of what LLMs can't do. I feel like it's all the rage now to talk about the time horizon metric, right? You know, that graph of like, oh, we've discovered that if something is only like a couple hours, then AIs can surpass human performance on it. But if something takes like a few days, then the human will surpass the AI. Do you think that that's a good metric to look at? And do you think it's like, yep, it's never going to get past a day? Like I'm putting a hard firewall on a 1 day time horizon.
I think that sort of dovetails with what I've been saying about putting a lot of complexity into the context window. The longer that it takes, I mean, not every task is like that, but there's at least a vague correlation between how long it takes a person to do something and the amount of idiosyncratic knowledge not on the internet that you have to learn over the course of doing this task. And that would explain why the more short and self-contained a task is, generally the better that an LLM is at doing it. And I don't know, again, clearly the line is going up, so I don't know exactly when it will stop, but I think that it's sort of it's different than how humans solve problems. And
Mhm.
I think that I think there's something fundamental there, and time will tell exactly where the ceiling is.
Do you think LLMs today can do everything that an IQ 80 human can do?
So if I wanted to think of a task that an IQ 80 person would do better, I would try to come up with something that involves figuring things out over the course of like days and weeks. I think that's where the human brain can shine relative to LLMs. learning to juggle. I guess you would say that doesn't count because LLMs don't have motor control. If you like made a learning to juggle text-based game where you sort of mapped this is kind of stupid. You'd have to put the person in a sufficiently complicated environment. Or here's another one, like give the person a funny gadget that you just invented in the next room and give them a couple weeks to play with it. And they will get really good at, using the gadget as a tool and putting the gadget, balancing the gadget on their head, and they'll like understand it inside and out in a way, as if it was their own hand. I guess that's kind of a stupid example too, because then you're going to complain that LLMs are not as good at multimodal stuff.
I don't know. I think that there might be something to it. I mean, maybe instead of a gadget, maybe it could just even be like a Wordle or Sudoku or something, like a game that you can still, or Tetris, right?
Yeah, I don't recall how Claude Plays Pokemon is going these days, but it was not impressing me very much. It needed a lot of hand-holding last time I checked in on it.
Yeah, I'm not
I
sure.
think IQ 80 people, I guess I don't really know what IQ 80 corresponds to in terms of people in the real world, but I imagine that they are at least potentially better at playing Pokemon than Claude without
Hmm.
hand-holding. Especially like if
I
you
mean,
give the person a tutorial, which Claude was able to read every tutorial on the internet during pre-training.
I bring this up because before when we were talking about like, okay, AI is not robust, it makes these simple mistakes, it can't fix its mistakes. But I think we might have a tendency to be comparing it to like above average IQ humans. And it's possible that it's just like very close or it's already just kind of cleanly beaten lower IQ humans. Like it's hard to tell, right? Like maybe everything like maybe lower IQ humans are constantly making similar mistakes and just society is just it's able to just recover from those mistakes, help them recover and we just don't notice it.
Yeah, I mean, semi-menial jobs like, I don't know, warehouse workers, grocery baggers. I do think, again, it's hard to compare because LLMs don't have robot bodies, but if I try to imagine like building a text-based system that's sufficiently analogous to bagging groceries, then I think that in a below average person with weeks or months of trial and error will eventually get better at bagging groceries than, an LLM struggling in this complicated text-based grocery bagging system. If you put it in enough like low level details about, now you have to move your arm this way and now you have to move your arm that way.
When you're saying, "Hey, we don't have brain like AGI," it's almost like your claim is that we don't have like 120 IQ brain like AGI.
Yeah, I think there's a better learning algorithm, a more powerful and scary and dangerous learning algorithm out there. And I think people are going to discover it sooner or later.
But I mean, you see what I'm saying, right? Is even your claim about a separation between humans and AIs, it sounds like you're not as confident being like an 80 IQ human will hold their own against an AI for many years.
I think you'd have to pick the right task. Humans have a way of growing in their knowledge over time. The knowledge that they need, they gradually learn it in a way that I think LLMs struggle with. But LLMs have a higher starting point. So it's a little hard to come up with those tasks. But if we're talking about things like, wiping out humanity and running the world by itself, I don't think, a good starting point and then, not really being able to, systematically learn as you go in a human-like way, I don't think that's adequate.
All right. Now, to summarize what you said before, you think what the human brain is doing is essentially better RL, right? Some algorithm that's a better member of the class of reinforcement learning algorithms than what we have now with LLMs. But we also have other successful examples like AlphaGo of systems that are achieving things that LLMs can't achieve by using different types of reinforcement learning. So I think maybe you and I are on the same page that like some puzzle piece, some ingredient from the world of ML is going to come and like integrate with the ingredients we have now in the world of LLMs, and then you'll just have something that's more brain-like.
Yeah, better model-based RL, and we can be agnostic about how much of the secret sauce is in the model versus in the reinforcement learning. There are still yet to be discovered secrets in the world of learning algorithms. There's a lot of learning algorithms. We haven't discovered them all yet.
Now, you've written that you're expecting something that's actor-critic model-based reinforcement learning. So could you explain how is actor-critic model-based reinforcement learning different from regular reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so I'm using the term in a pretty broad way. I do think that reinforcement learning in the brain is kind of different from reinforcement learning in reinforcement learning textbooks. AI textbooks. So for example, some idea pops into my head, like I'm going to open the window, and then that seems like a good idea or a bad idea. And if it seems like a good idea, then I actually do it. And so I would propose that there's one part of my brain, roughly the cortex, that is the genesis of this idea. I'm going to go open the window, and a different part of my brain, namely the brainstem in conjunction with the striatum, that is like that's a good idea or that's a bad idea. So that's kind of what I mean by actor-critic.
And what's the actor and what's the critic again?
So the actor would be like proposing an idea. I'm going to go open the window, and the critic would be like, that's not a motivating idea. Don't do that. Or yes, do that. And if the critic says yes, then I actually stand up and walk over to the window and open it.
Have you mapped actor and critic to different brain regions?
Yes. I think the actor is basically the cortex to a first approximation, and the critic is basically the striatum, and then the hypothalamus and brainstem are kind of a ground truth that updates the critic.
So the striatum is part of the learning brain, right? The learning from scratch brain.
Yeah, it's its own kind of learning algorithm.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit more? Because you've got the learning from scratch brain and you've got the cortex versus the striatum. So how do those interact when you're learning?
I think the cortex proposes a thought, like, or an idea, a plan, or whatever. I'm going to go open the window. And then the striatum sort of takes as an input that thought. Well, the striatum does a few other things too, but the relevant one for this conversation is that the striatum takes that thought and tries to judge whether it's a good idea or a bad idea on the basis of these connections, which have been learned over the course of your lifetime based on what has tickled your innate drives versus what has not.
And that's kind of a layer before we also do the check-in with the steering brain.
Yeah. So the steering brain is updating the striatum in hindsight, and also the steering brain is sometimes overruling the striatum at the moment. So like if I'm in pain right now, then that probably whatever I'm thinking about is a bad thing.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it's kind of like layers of management, where the striatum is just like closer to the line manager, and the steering brain is more of like the CEO or the owner.
The striatum is making a guess at what's good and bad, and it has more to work with for its guess because it has all these neurons and all these connections to like your rich understanding of the world. Maybe the striatum is like the teaching assistant, and the brainstem is like the professor or something. So the teaching assistant is grading the homework, and the professor is sometimes noticing that, something really bad happened and the teaching assistant didn't catch it and saying, yo, teaching assistant, you did this wrong.
Makes sense. When you look at Jeff Hawkins's research, do you think that is going to have one of the ingredients for the actor-critic reinforcement learning that we can copy from the brain?
So he's basically entirely focused on how the cortex works. He's very uninterested in fact, outright dismissive towards understanding the hypothalamus and brainstem. I think he has really bad takes on AI safety that come from his unwillingness to spend even 5 minutes thinking about how motivation works. So for example, if you read his most recent book, like if you read one chapter, it says like the cortex builds a model of the world, and a model is not dangerous by itself. It's just like a map sitting on the table.
Oof.
Oh, it's even worse than that. He talks about how like the cortex wants to undermine the brainstem, and the cortex is the home of all these higher drives like morality, curiosity, and making the world a better place. So there's like this glaring contradiction between the cortex is like a map on a table versus the cortex is the source of all of these higher drives like morality. I think the reconciliation is that in fact morality, just like in curiosity, just like everything else, are coming from the hypothalamus and brainstem. And we're going to need to reverse engineer and put those in our AGI. And the question is, how do we do that?
Makes sense. Okay, so Hawkins is kind of at a dead end in your perspective.
I mean, if you want to know what the 6 layers of the cortex are doing and why, like there's lots of people who are trying to figure that out, alas. And Hawkins is one of many people who are theorizing about the exact role of the, cortex thalamus cortex circuits, and what's layer 4 doing and what's layer 2, 3 doing, and on and on.
All right, getting back to your research, what you're focusing on, you're anticipating brain-like AGI, and you're anticipating that this kind of new actor-critic reinforcement learning that's getting us farther than LLMs have ever gotten us and is doing longer-term horizon tasks successfully, you're anticipating that this new kind of brainline AGI is going to be referring to a new kind of reward function, and you don't think it's going to look like predicting the next word. You think it's going to look like legible Python code.
So I do think that part of the human brain is doing predictive learning. So you reach out to the door handle and you expect it to, turn easily, or you expect it to be quiet, but it makes a noise and you're surprised by that. You wind up with this complicated model of the world that's able to make really good predictions about what will happen in the future. And I do think that works by predictive learning in a way that's, structurally analogous to a next token prediction. I don't think it's a transformer architecture, but it is still a learning algorithm that's trained on predictive learning. We can think about what's special about the reward function from a capabilities perspective, and then we can think about what's special about the human reward function from an alignment perspective. From a capabilities perspective, I really just don't think it's that hard to make a reward function that would lead to powerful capabilities. I think alignment is much harder, but if you just want a reward function that leads to powerful capabilities in the context of brain-like AGI, you need curiosity, you need a few other odds and ends, but mostly the reward function is important for alignment from my perspective. And the learning algorithm and the update rules are what's important for capabilities.
That makes sense. I think one distinction you are making is we're not expecting the reward function to be an inscrutable mess. We're expecting it to be an actual Python module that a human can curate.
So if and when people make a brain-like AGI, then they can put whatever they want as the reward function. So I think that almost anything that they choose to put in would be terribly dangerous. And the question is what could they put in the reward function that would actually lead to good outcomes, like an AI that doesn't want to kill its programmers and its users and everybody else. The direction that I'm most optimistic, or at least pessimistic about, would be a reward function that looks like more or less legible Python code, as opposed to something more like RLHF, where it's trained on thousands of examples of good and bad behavior. I think that the latter is doomed, and we can talk about exactly why I think that.
The inscrutable matrices are doomed? Yeah, unpack that a little bit.
So when people talk about inscrutable matrices, they're often talking about the learning algorithm, and I do expect that a brain-like AGI will still learn a world model that is inscrutable, just because what else are you going to do? It's a complicated world. Tires are usually black, and garbage trucks are often blue. There's just so many things about the world, and you're not going to be putting those in the source code. Instead, they need to be in some kind of learned model. And whether they're, entries of a matrix or whatever else, they're probably going to be inscrutable. They're going to be these unlabeled things by default. So there's really no getting around inscrutable matrices, or at least inscrutable learned models. From my perspective, I don't know why people talk as if there's another option.
Mm-hmm.
But separately, the reward function might or might not involve learning algorithm components. So the RLHF reward function that's used in large language models is a learned function. So people thumbs up and thumbs down lots of different, LLM behaviors, and that's used to train this reward model. So you could do that with brain-like AGI too. I think it would not lead to good outcomes. I think it would lead to psychopathic AI that tries to kill everybody.
Interesting. Okay, so there's three different types of popular reward functions, right? So the first is predict the next word in a giant corpus, or predict the next token, even if it's like video data or whatever. And then the next one is humans giving you thumbs up and thumbs down, and predict the shape of the high dimensional manifold of thumbs up and thumbs down, which is kind of inscrutable. And then the third one is here's this Python code, which is a closed form expression of what stuff is worth, right? Are those three categories? Are there other interesting categories?
I might call the first one a loss function rather than a reward function. It's self-supervised learning is usually called a predictive loss. And I think in brain-like AGI, it's more structurally different from the reward function than it is in LLMs. In LLMs, you're it's sort of the same kind of update that you make during self-supervised learning during the pre-training phase versus the RLHF phase. It's all just gradient descent. But I think in the brain, it's kind of different. In one case, you're updating, certain types of cortex connections. In a different case, maybe you're updating the striatum or something.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying there's this new, more powerful paradigm of machine learning that we're going to get to. And that paradigm is just generally not going to go with reward functions that are messy. It's just going to fit nicely with neater reward functions. Is there some connection there?
I mean, I think that if you hooked up an RLHF reward function to a sufficiently good RL system, it would also be really bad because it would find edge cases in the learned reward model and relentlessly optimize them, including taking over the world as necessary. It would be really bad. But the reason that you don't get that you could get that with RLHF if you turn off the regularization or whatever. Sometimes there's like KL divergence or they modulate the learning rate or something to prevent it from going off the rails. But when the LLMs are optimizing too hard on the RLHF reward function, they tend to do kind of stupid things like they'll, output bob, 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 or something stupid. They won't make foresighted, dangerous actions. And that's where it becomes relevant that I think the human brain model-based RL system is just better. You give it some weird reward function and it will make good plans to optimize that reward function. It'll do foresighted planning. It'll come up with out-of-the-box ideas. It won't just go bob, 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 bob. Instead, it will, take over the world and make bob outputs or whatever. That's a silly example, but I think reward models are kind of inherently limited in that way. And it's not just about brain-like AGI, but rather it interacts with the fact that brain-like AGI is a more powerful solution finder.
It's a more powerful solution finder, but you're saying the upvotes and downvotes could still work, especially in the early stages where it's not powerful enough and you're just giving it upvotes and downvotes. Wouldn't that still work the same way LLMs work?
Sure. But I'm interested in the solutions that will continue to work when the AI gets smarter.
Okay, gotcha. So you're thinking ahead to this new regime, which I also think is likely, where it's like, yep, these things are basically magic wands, or what Eliezer calls outcome pumps. Are you a fan of that thought experiment?
I know what you're referring to. I think there's a lot of nuance in whether that's what we should expect and if there's steps we can take to avoid that.
Do you think that outcome pumps are, I mean, not literally outcome pumps, but like computable approximations of outcome pumps is like a convergent future that we're likely to slide into?
So an outcome pump, for listeners who aren't familiar with that, that's this like thought experiment where there's like a magic button where you type in an outcome and it like travels through time to figure out the course of events that make that outcome actualize. So we are all outcome pumps insofar as we have desires about what the world is like in the future and we take actions to try to make those desires happen. But we also desire other things. We like to follow norms. Sometimes we don't care all that much about what happens in the future. So I like to talk about AIs or more generally systems that have desires about what the world is like in the future. So you and I have desires about what the world is like in the future. Most humans do to some extent. And we desire other things too. I want to eat lunch right now, in addition to, caring that my child, grows up and has a good life and, has grandchildren or whatever. I expect that we will eventually build AIs that likewise has desires about what the world is like in the future and acts on those desires. So you could call that an outcome pump. I mean, we'll also make AIs that don't. We're already making AIs that don't. But ultimately, there are people who have desires about the future and they're trying to make, we want there to be a better solar cell. We want, world peace, whatever. We want to, get a Nobel Prize and a, cool benchmark score that gets us into NeurIPS. So people have been trying to make AIs that act as if they have desires about the state of the world in the future. And I expect that they'll keep trying that until they eventually succeed. But then a separate question is like, will the AI act as if it only has desires about the future, or will it act as if it also has other kinds of desires too, like desires to follow norms or, desires to not rock the boat too much or whatever else. And it's at least conceivable that we can make AIs that have these desires about the future, but also have other desires. And that could be a way to get away from the problem. I didn't say the downside of the outcome pump. If you have desires about the future, it leads to instrumental convergence, which, as probably many listeners know, is the idea of like, well, if I want the world to be a certain way in the future, then what should I do right now? I should gather resources. I should gather influence. I should take over foreign countries so that I can do with them as I please and, continue to increase my wealth and influence. I'll be able to bribe people. I'll be able to, you name it. It helps to have tons of money acquired, however it is. It helps to have a good reputation. It helps to have all of these sort of things. And so if you have desires about the future and you have incredible power, then you wind up with like the AI that takes over the world in order to actualize its desires. And that's bad. So I think desires about the future is the source of capabilities, and it's also the source of danger. And so that's sort of the needle that you have to thread. And I think part of threading that is that we can make AIs that also have other desires that are not just about the future.
Yep. Okay, so I agree with all that, except for maybe this idea that we can have them have other desires, but not about the future. I think maybe you and I have some disagreement. I think you have flagged that as a major disagreement between you and Eliezer Yudkowsky, right?
I've been accused of misunderstanding Eliezer, so we should just say that this is a like possible position that somebody should have, whether it's actually what Eliezer believes or I'm misunderstanding him.
Yeah, regardless of what Eliezer believes, I am somebody who tends to agree with Eliezer. And I can tell you that I personally believe, regardless of what he believes, that it seems like everything will converge to a coherent utility function. And so when you're describing like, oh, it won't just have desires about the future, it'll also have these other desires. My guess is that it'll just fold the other desires into the utility function and like streamline everything into one master utility function. But you don't think so?
So just saying a utility function is kind of vacuous because it depends on what the domain of the utility function is. Like if the utility function says like, this particular action sequence is good, and then I'm going to do this particular action sequence, and maybe it involves spinning around in a circle and not accomplishing anything, but I'm still a utility maximizer. So, or I could have a utility function that says I should make decisions according to decision rules X. That would be the best thing to do. So it's completely vacuous to just say that I'm acting according to a utility function.
Okay. Then yeah, I'll refine my claim. So I refine my claim that the utility function, it won't have a deontological flavor. It'll just really clearly be about the domain of like future outcomes or like, universe states over time.
Yeah. So if you say that the domain of the utility function, the input to the utility function is what the world is like in the future, then yeah, then you're making a claim that the AI cares about what the world is like in the future. And that's definitely a substantive claim. You get power, you get instrumental convergence.
I think to the degree that it does care, and actually the argument I want to make now is I always defend utilitarians because people are like, oh, Liron, you really think you're a utilitarian? So that means you don't care about people and love and feelings. You just only care about utility. I'm like, well, no, I just rolled the love and feelings into my utility. I still care about that stuff. And I think that an aligned AI would look the same way, right? Is it would have all of these nice fuzzy values as part of what it likes about the future state of the universe.
I mean, that would be nice if we made an AI that actually just wanted a good future. But there's also things like how it gets there. You could imagine an AI that wants a good future, so it like where humans are empowered, so it like disempowers all humans and then gathers lots of resources and then re-empowers humans later on. But you could also imagine an AI that wants humans to never be disempowered in the first place. So that would be sort of, I guess you could call that deontological. But again, I don't know. It's easy to get into rolling up utilitarianism with, making vacuous claims that are tautological.
Okay, well, I want to tie this back to the concept of the Python code, which represents the reward function. Because when you think about solving the alignment problem and making the future go well, I think you're pretty focused on that piece, right? Because I saw you wrote that you think that the AI companies are going to get in a position where they've got this new paradigm where they're using this new actor-critic ML and suddenly they're getting better results, instead of just a 2-week time horizon or whatever. Now it's like a 2-year time horizon and we're clearly an ASI takeoff. But they're going to have trouble with their reward function because they're gonna see instrumental convergence, and their AIs are going to be like harder to control than ever, or like they keep doing the equivalent of Mecha Hitler, right? They keep getting like really hardcore Machiavellian on their masters, and like the utility functions are just problematic. And you want to basically be waiting in the wings, having done this research on like what the ideal legible reward function is that they can just grab from the literature, and it'll make their AIs work better and steer the future better.
Yeah, yeah. I tend to think of this as being in the tradition of, quote unquote RL research and AI, as opposed to in the tradition of how RL has been used in the LLM era. So if you look at, AlphaGo or something, the reward function is this really straightforward thing that says that winning is good and losing is bad. If you look at, OpenAI Gen and basically all the other quote unquote RL environments, they almost always have a sort of simple legible reward functions. And I think that if people sort of continue in that tradition, they're going to make RL agents that have simple legible reward functions of various sorts. And I think that's going to be catastrophically dangerous, because if you put a sufficiently powerful RL system on some, random reward function, like, win at this race, or, move the boxes, or beat the Atari game, or whatever it is, but, something in the real world, then all of a sudden, turning off the program becomes a barrier to optimizing that reward function. So that would be really bad. And we want there to be, better options in the RL paradigm for reward functions that don't lead to catastrophically dangerous behavior.
So I agree with you that we're pretty likely to get into a point in time where we can see the AIs that are optimizing the world toward legible goals. I think that's already kind of a good way to fail, because I actually think that like by the time they get to that point, we might have such a fast boom where it's like, oh, they started developing like better learning in their lab, and they already like embarked on a plan to take over the world even before we kind of noticed and printed out what their Python reward function is. Even before we got to that point, it's like too late, we're already dead. So for me, it's kind of interesting if we even live to the point where we can be like, oh, yeah, they're clearly trying to like make more money than us, and then they're clearly trying to like maximize the number of GPUs covering the planet. Oh, interesting. Like I think we might actually watch them doing those kinds of legible goals. Like we'll have a chance to observe that, and we might be able to identify a part of their code and even have the chance to edit it. Like we might actually be in that scenario that's kind of like your mainline good scenario, right? Of like, we see where the levers of control are, this reward function, and we have a chance at it. So I agree with your premise that there's like a significant chance that this may be like the opportunity and like the piece of the puzzle that we can shape, that you can shape. This is like your research program. So like, I agree this is like a plausible, good thing to focus on. But then the problem is, I just still think that whatever you put as that Python reward function is almost certainly going to go awry.
So I don't claim to have a great plan right now. So time will tell whether I come up with something. I don't want to make some claim that a blocker doesn't exist until I actually have a good plan. Maybe there's blockers that I still haven't appreciated, and as I spend more time trying to puzzle over possible reward functions. But I do want to say that I think human brains are built with these, relatively simple social reward functions, and humans are at least nice sometimes, and at least not very obviously terrible. So that's at least like an existence proof that maybe there's a path here.
Okay, yeah, let me double click on that. You're saying you don't claim to have like a high probability of success or a solid plan at this point in time. And it doesn't sound like you're that optimistic necessarily about the human species as a whole solving the problem, which brings me to the ultimate question, surprisingly late in the interview. Are you ready for this?
Sure.
P doom, P doom, what's your P doom? What's your P doom? What's your P doom?
Dr. Stephen Byrnes, what's your P doom?
I don't know, like 90% or something. But I kind of pulled that number out of my ass. So take it for what it
It's
is.
so high.
I think yeah, it things seem pretty grim to me. There's but of course we're working to make it better. So yeah.
Okay, it's kind of funny because I normally get the P Doom question out of the way early, and I kind of forgot and skipped it. And like we did this interesting interview, and now we're like getting close to the wrap up, and we're like, oh, by the way, my P Doom's 90%.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues that go into that, and yeah, we can talk about the different contributions.
Wow. Okay. So, and then when you think about like the success of your own program, that kind of implies that you think you have like a pretty low chance of success.
Um, I don't know. I think uh um it's possible. Like I'm doing the best I can. I think there's a decent chance that like I'll come up with some plan that like kind of works in principle, but is like hard and expensive to implement and like very easy to go awry. And then like even if it's implemented right, it turns out that, you know, like we don't even know that like these alleged, if you take these alleged like bioengineered high IQ humans that you were talking about earlier in the interview, like we don't know that they would actually like be good. Maybe with great power comes great corruption, even if you start with a good person. And yeah, I'm not sure it's that decision relevant. And I don't like how PDOM has become sort of this tribal marker that's blown out of
Hmm.
proportion to its actual decision relevance, which is not zero. Like obviously, you're getting lots of important information about people's stance towards the problem.
Yeah, I feel you. And certainly Eliezer has made himself clear that he is not a fan of PDOM. For my part, the reason I bring up PDOM so often in this podcast is because I am trying to move the Overton window. So people who watch episode after episode, they're like, oh, wow, all of these incredibly intelligent people are telling us that there's a high chance that we're doomed. Like maybe the message will get through.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate that that's not like PDOM from LLMs next year, but rather like PDOM from I don't know, in my lifetime or something.
Hmm. Okay, I want to get a couple things out of the way that I think we'll easily agree about. One of them is that when we talk about LLMs, I think you and I are both happy with the net positive contribution that LLMs made so far, correct?
Yeah, LLMs as of today I like to bring up things like LLM assisted spear phishing maybe being a potentially bad thing and LLM virtual friends being potentially worrisome. But by and large, I think the LLMs are a cool technology. And if they LLM progress halted today, then I'd be like happy and thank the person who invented them.
Exactly. And it seems like we could even get rid of the safety departments at the AI companies and like sure you'd have a mecha Hitler here or like a bias there, but like whatever, like that's just fine. Like we'll solve it.
Yeah, I mean, if we got rid of them, the companies would bring them back because they don't want, Mecha Hitler.
Exactly. So, it's stating the obvious from our perspective, but just in case the audience is confused, it's not like you and I hate technology. We don't hate LLMs. Like, we think everything is great. We just are seeing a little bit into the future where things are different and then we get destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, it helps that I'm not like an illustrator who's at risk of losing his job or whatever.
Right. Exactly. Okay. The other thing I wanted to get out of the way that I think is probably going to be an easy yes is just this question of is there lots of headroom above human intelligence?
Yes, very much yes.
Okay. How much does being super intelligent really let you do? Because there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, there's going to be an AI that's so brilliant. Physics is so easy for it, but it still can't do that much more. It's still going to like be bottlenecked. The government's still going to like slow it down and regulate it.
I like to talk about scaling horizontally rather than vertically. So you can have no human can be doing a billion things at once around the world, but you can have a billion copies of an AI that are, running a whole civilization. Also, the AIs will be able to think much faster than humans, I expect. And, they'll be able to figure things out the way that the, sharpest humans are able to figure things out. They'll be as charismatic as the most charismatic humans. They'll be as persuasive as the most persuasive humans.
Okay, but hear me out. But hear me out. You have to perform experiments at a human timescale, and that'll slow you down.
Yeah, I think, again, I don't think the AIs will be born already knowing everything about everything. I don't think that's really necessary for the like AI takeover story. Um, the AIs can wipe out humans and then do lots of experiments to learn about how to do things. We shouldn't tell takeover stories that require the AI to know things that it has no way to already know.
Does Gödel's incompleteness theorem prove that machines can never have the level of insight that humans have? Just answer yes or no.
No.
Okay. All right, you hear that, guys? How about this? if we had a super intelligent AI in a data center, but it didn't have a body, it didn't have physical actuators, could it still easily take over?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer I give is like, well, it can harness millions of humans. It can just slide into everybody's DMs and start cajoling them or employing them. I mean, the humans are the actuators.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to talk about, if you take Joseph Stalin on one side and every other Russian combined on the other side, who would win in a fight? Obviously, the millions of other Russians. And yet Stalin still wound up, I don't think he was a particularly strong person. He didn't have better weapons, but he still wound up with dictatorial, totalitarian control over Russia because
Right.
he charmed, he used charisma, he used threats, he used all of his human skills, he used his brain.
I think there were like 30 million Russians that you can attribute their death to Stalin or something. Like I think at least 10 million. Like he's actually worse than Hitler if you just look at death count. And I'm Jewish, but I'm willing to admit Stalin was worse than Hitler in terms of like moral valence. And like all of those 10 million Russians would have liked to see him dead, but they died.
Yep. Yeah. And that would be like a lower bound for, Stalin only had a single human brain, but he was still able to do all that.
Okay, so we're obviously on the same page. And you've explicitly said that you don't even think AIs have to keep humans around for an appreciable amount of time. It's not like, oh, keep the humans around to run the world. You pretty much think, no, they'll just like escape and they'll just run the world on their own.
I mean, that is what I think. I'm not sure how important that belief is. You can disagree with me on that and then tell a different story where the AI, preempts any other equally powerful AIs from being created and, maneuvers its way into lots of political and other power over the world over the course of however many years or decades it takes to build more and more robots. And then once it can run the world on its own, then it wipes out humans. And that's like not a more reassuring story, but it's not a story that requires, this MacGyver thing where the AI has like one robot body and that one robot body builds a second robot body and gathers more solar cells. And I do think that MacGyver story is something that could happen, but it's not necessary to get to do.
Yeah, my personal most likely scenario is I do think that it'll build a certain type of like workhorse technology that's different from what we humans think of as like a major technology to lean on. I think an obvious candidate is like nanotech, where it's like, yep, these machines are really good and it's actually kind of easy for me to build and control them, even though for humans it would have been like decades away. And that's why maybe this idea of like, oh, I need humans' bodies to like come around and do work for me, I feel like may not be long lived. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I don't have much opinions about nanotech in particular.
Okay, maybe you're on the same page as me, which is like you think about the situation and you think about how high the headroom is, right? For me, it always comes back to that. There's so much headroom, in my opinion, above human intelligence, that when I think of an AI tapping into that headroom, I'm just expecting a lot of fireworks. I'm not expecting it to just look like, okay, there's new management here.
Yeah, you could think of like all the things that advanced persistent threat actors can do. The like state level hackers,
Hmm.
they can basically hack into any system on the planet, given enough, given some skills and time, and what they can do, an AI could do too. Basically, hack into any system on the
Right. I mean, the
planet.
Mossad, right? The Israeli Mossad famously does this, right? With Stuxnet, where it like messed with the centrifuges, even though they were air gapped. So it like messed up Iran's centrifuges and set the nuclear program back. And then recently, like, the pager operation or the way that it was able to just like pick off like Iran's entire military leadership in the latest war. Sorry to root for Israel, which is, my home country. But it's just an example of how you can have these computer scientists, these hackers working in a lab at a certain localized point and then have these like very impressive attacks. But now imagine that that's happening like every hour of the day, right? So that kind of operation that took like 20 years of planning, right? Like many generations of Israelis joining the army, helping with this plan. Just imagine that's constantly happening.
Yeah, like the most skilled employee at the National Security Agency, or the most skillful team copied 100,000 times working in parallel is really a terrifying prospect as step one of world takeover.
So once we add up our answers to all of these questions, like, yep, there's a lot of headroom. It's probably going to invent its own technology. It's not going to need to lead on humans that much. This all adds up to kind of the OG, the original Yudkowsky and Foom, right? And I think you and I are on the same page that we're OGs, and we think that people have started acting like Foom is like old school, and you don't have to talk about Foom anymore, and you can just talk about like LLMs and training data. And we're like, no, Foom is still coming. Don't forget about Foom.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't yet talked about how gradual the process is to get from where we are now to superintelligence, but I do expect a not very gradual process, but rather a pretty sudden process that everybody's very unprepared for.
Right. So your graph of how crazy it's going to get is like kind of shallow relative to what the Darios of the world are pitching, right? That you think that they're getting a little bit ahead of themselves, and you're expecting a more of a shallow curve for another 5, 10, even 20 years. But then you're expecting like this new paradigm to come online, which will be like a real inflection point, and then there's not necessarily another year of humanity after that point.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, my LLM graph is going to look different from Dario's if I think that LLMs are going to eventually plateau, and he doesn't. So that's not unexpected. But then, yeah, the sort of more substantive claim is that I think that when people, well, it's possible that this alleged dangerous next paradigm is already being worked on in obscure toy models on archive, but it's not, nobody cares yet. There's a million toy models on archive, and nobody's keeping track of them. And we're not learning anything about AGI safety by experimenting with them because they're not like using human language, and they're not doing foresighted planning in a way that's really analogous to the problems that we are anticipating for AGI. And I think that by the time this, alleged scary next paradigm is good enough to really be, you can see the AGI and the superintelligence in the glint of its eye, metaphorically, there's going to be really very little time left before the superintelligence is actually there.
You make a very bold claim. You're saying that the amount of R&D standing between us and this true brain-like AGI could be less than 30 person years. So it could be like less than a single researcher working for 30 years, or like a team of 3 researchers working for 10 years. You think that may be all it takes to get us to brain-like AGI?
I really want to clarify that that's from the starting point of it's already doing impressive things that are obviously like proto-AGI-ish, the kinds of things that LLMs are doing. They're using language, they're solving problems, they're like legitimately helpful with, alignment research and capabilities research in a human-like way. I think when you get that far, then you're already almost at superintelligence. I don't think that that's I don't think that's how much work it takes from today.
Got it. Okay, so you're not factoring in like the trial and error of people exploring different directions. You're saying like somebody already did that, and then from that starting gun, then there's going to be another 30 person years or
Yeah,
less.
exactly. I don't know how many person years of toy models we have left in us. It might be quite many.
Interesting. Do you think that you would notice when the starting gun fires? You're like, oh, this is the final paradigm. I can see it.
If I had any opinion about that, I probably wouldn't talk about it publicly.
All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. I know Eliezer used to, I feel like he doesn't say it as much, but he used to say that a lot of like, whenever people would say like, oh, do you think AI is going this way? He's like, I'm not going to tell you what I think is the most productive route to developing AGI, which is like, I mean, fair enough, right? I mean, if our PDOM is pretty high, we shouldn't go around telling people how to do gain of function research.
Yeah. Or, which cheap uranium enrichment technologies are like the most promising ones.
Right. Okay. Now, even though you're not going to be specific, understandably, you have written that the last pieces of this puzzle to get us really close to brain-like AGI, it could be very elegant puzzle pieces like Judea Pearl's causal inference networks, or my words, the transformer architecture. Doesn't that represent a piece of the puzzle that like, it's actually pretty simple. There's no particular reason why we had to find it this late in the game?
Yeah. I think it's going to be a different kind of learning algorithm, and history suggests that learning algorithms are not terribly complicated. Like if you think
Mhm.
about it, learning algorithms probably shouldn't be terribly complicated because it's this one thing, that's able to do language and reasoning and planning. If you think about the cortex, it's the same kind of cortex that does. So if it's this like Rube Goldberg machine, you're not going to build some Rube Goldberg machine learning algorithm that can learn language, but also can learn vision, but also can, do motor control and sensory and planning and all these other things. It's going to have to be built on sort of more simple and elegant principles, you would think.
Mhm. Now, we both agree that when this barrier comes down, when we finally figure out that new RL actor-critic paradigm, then it's probably too late to save the world because, in a word, overhang. like training resource overhang. It could be a tiny amount of training resources, like the brain is known for using a tiny amount of training resources during its life relative to how many resources are in the world. Inference resources are also going to be very tiny. So you won't even need these crazy gigawatt data centers. They'll be overkill. Tons of hardware overhang. Manipulable humans are a type of overhang, right? Think about how many people you could DM and get them to do your bidding if you were clever enough. Neg entropy overhang, just like, so many atoms that you could configure into nanobots, solar radiation. There's just like an embarrassment of riches here once you have sufficient intelligence.
Yeah. It's controversial how much compute and data the brain uses, but I happen to agree. I have like lots of opinions about. I'm very much on the it won't take very much compute to do the things that the human brain is able to do, like invent technology and get around the world. I think like thousands of times less than today's large language models for training. But yeah, I just want to flag that that's my opinion and it's controversial.
Well, it's also my opinion. I think it's a lot of hype doom people's opinion. If you use the analogy of a powder keg, right? There's so much gunpowder lying around, but it's literally like everything is powder. Like neg entropy, it's not like just a nuclear explosion where it's like, oh, wow, that nuclear bomb is such a big explosion, such positive feedback, exponential growth in that nuclear explosion. Wow. But then it ran out of fuel. But the difference is with the AI, it never runs out of fuel because it's like everything is fuel. It'll just keep using every bit of fuel in the universe.
Yeah, I mean, definitely big mountain of gunpowder. Like every computer system that an APT team could theoretically hack into is gunpowder that is bound to explode when a sufficient unaligned intelligence starts working on it. And yeah, so it's pretty terrifying.
To recap where we stand, maybe you and I are slightly disagreeing in terms of like you feel really confident that there's going to be like a paradigm shift to brain-like AGI. I'm more open to the idea of like LLMs with like a little tweak might do the job. So we differ a little bit there.
We'll find out one way or the other.
Right. We'll probably find out. That's right. But we're both on the same page that like when this barrier gets transcended, like you can put up a metric saying like AIs just beat humans at like month-long tasks or whatever, right? There's like some starting on there where it's like once we get there, we're both expecting to be off to the races. We're not expecting this kind of like gentle, like, oh yeah, the AI companies are worth $1 trillion now. No, $1 trillion is going to be chump change at that point, or like money is going to be chump change.
Yeah, if money exists at that point. Really, of course, I expect everybody to die, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So basically, we both have this kind of like unsurvivable, huge order of magnitude concept of like what happens above a certain threshold, which I think is important to point out that our doom predictions, I think both me and you and Eliezer and a lot of people, our doom prediction has always been conditional on a certain superhuman threshold being crossed. And so our excuse, people are like, oh, how are you backtracking? We're not doomed today. Our excuse is just like, okay, yeah, we got really close to the threshold. And I'll be honest, I didn't expect to just be hovering this close to the threshold, but I don't think it's fair to say that we crossed the threshold.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I don't think LLMs are the powerful, scary kind of AI as of today, and we can argue about what it will look like, but I don't think we've gotten there yet.
So viewers, I hope you guys have been listening to a lot of Steven's answers, and you may have noticed that they're similar to what I'm always arguing with my guests about on the show. Things like headroom above human intelligence. Yes, obviously there is. Orthogonality thesis. Yes, obviously it's true. Guys, this is like the answer key. When I talk to my other guests, yes, I'm debating them, and yes, they're saying different opinions, but they're obviously wrong. Okay, this episode is my chance to bring you another person who's thought about everything for himself, clearly a polymath, studied neuroscience, physics, math, computer science, AI, postdoctoral studies at Harvard, PhD from UC Berkeley, undergraduate at Harvard, and his whole career in the last 5 years is AGI safety researcher. I'm just a podcaster. I have a bachelor's, but to the extent that you guys are trusting the Harvard educational system,
big mistake right there.
I think you should listen to Dr. Steve Byrnes whizzing through these questions. And it's crazy because from our perspective, yes, this is just like a victory lap. Obviously, not all my guests agree, but from our perspective, these other guests or these other people who I'm doing reaction episodes to are like so far from making any sense. I think we mentioned Jan LeCun, Robin Hansen, Richard Hanania giving a P-Doom of like less than 5%. Isn't that outside of what you might call the sane zone?
I don't want to call I'm too polite to call people sane or insane. I think they're wrong, but lots of people are wrong about lots of things, and I try to be sympathetic.
Okay, what about the idea that AI will keep us alive out of curiosity or out of knowledge seeking or out of information value? I had a well-known guest, Mike Israetel, who's a fitness entrepreneur and has a popular YouTube, and he was arguing that AIs will keep us alive out of curiosity. And Elon Musk is saying it's important to make the AI maximally truth-seeking, and that'll be our key to alignment. And from our perspective, it's just like, no, that's a tiny fraction of what you need for alignment. That's not going to get you far.
Yeah, I agree that that's neither of those plans is going to work.
What about this guy, Sayash Kapoor, who's one of the co-authors of AI Snake Oil? He was arguing that AI X risk probabilities shouldn't inform policy. What? Does that make any sense?
I think I read that, and I obviously had a bunch of complaints, but my biggest complaint was treating uncertainty about P-doom as synonymous with P-doom is low, and that's not the way to act under uncertainty. So, he was arguing these projections that, AI is probably going to kill us or probably not going to kill us. None of these are really based on anything because AI is different from any reference class. It's just very difficult to forecast. But if you're saying maybe AI has a 0.1% chance of killing me and everybody I love, or maybe it has a 99% chance of killing me and everybody I love. Who's to say? We cannot know. Therefore, let's do nothing whatsoever about it. That's crazy. That's not how you act under Knightian uncertainty. We can argue about how to act under Knightian uncertainty, but that ain't it. You can minimax and try to, assume the worst possible world, or you can do some kind of parliamentary thing or whatever. But yeah, just saying I'm going to treat the problem as non-existent because nobody can prove that it's. I also think the object level arguments are good and that P-doom is in fact high, separately from the unknowability factor.
Yep. Okay. So going back to the idea of how can people be so wrong? There's so many people who are hopeful that more intelligence means more morality, including Scott Sumner and Scott Aronson, who I tend to agree with most of what they say. They're undeniably really smart intellectual luminaries, but then you bring up the orthogonality thesis to them and suddenly they're clinging on to the idea that it's false.
Yeah, this is possibly a disanalogy between LLMs of today and future AI that at least I'm thinking about. So if you look at the human distribution, I don't have a strong opinion, but it seems at least possible to me that there's systematic correlations between morality and intelligence or whatever. I mean, there's definitely, I don't know, there's certainly intelligent people who are terrible, and also intelligent people who seem perfectly nice. But if there's a correlation, which, I don't have a strong opinion, but if there were a correlation, then presumably that could extend to LLMs, which after all have been trained on human data, and a lot of their behavioral tendencies are coming from the human distribution. But I'm thinking about these future AIs that are making decisions about what to do based on desires that come from this reward function and, selection on confidence rather than on what are humans likely to do in this situation? And then all bets are off. And you really can't be relying on the human distribution. And you have to go back to first principles and realize that you can't get an ought from an is.
I agree. Now, related to this idea that people are the orthogonality thesis is false, the arc of morality of sufficiently intelligent AIs bends toward justice or bends toward goodness, people might retreat from that claim and they'd be like, okay, yeah, orthogonality thesis is true. But what's a good alignment solution? Social evolution. If you guys want to hear an episode about that, you can search for Gil Mark on my channel, or you can search for Emmett Shear. I did a reaction episode to Emmett Shear talking about his company Softmax, which is doing some kind of social evolution as far as I gather. And they think that that's going to get a community of humans and AIs that are all aligned to one another. That's the best I can do representing him. He's always invited on the show if he wants to explain what he means more precisely than that. So Steve, you have considered this idea of social evolution as an alignment solution, and like me, you're just not seeing a lot of promise. You flagged a number of problems. Off the top of your head, what are the problems?
I'm not that familiar with what Emmett Shear is doing. I thought he was studying ant colonies and cells and stuff, and I just don't think that's really useful for AI at all. Maybe there's a vision that I'm not seeing, but ant colonies and cells are cooperating, but they're not doing foresighted planning and means and reasoning, which is where the power and where the danger of AI is coming. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Historically, in reinforcement learning, people generally just type up what reward function they want to use. So it was, winning at Go and AlphaGo. It's, winning at the video game for the Atari stuff, or the video game score, I guess. And they type up the reward function, and then they spend, 99.9% of their time working on the agent to optimize that reward function. And I'm saying that we should be working harder to design a good reward function and actually thinking about it instead of, devoting 0.1% of our RL textbooks to the reward function design. That should be like the first and foremost question. But then there's yet another option, which is to do an outer loop search for reward functions. And that's like the closest analogy to evolution, where, the reward function evolved by natural selection, just like the learning algorithm and everything else. And I think that's unlikely to be a good idea. Although, I don't want to rule it out entirely, but yeah, there's a bunch of problems. One is that you would presumably, to make it practical, you would have AIs that are like hanging out with other AIs, and they might develop good social instincts towards other AIs that don't generalize to humans, and that would be a problem. Another possible issue is that maybe they wouldn't evolve very cooperative instincts, just like, I don't know, like wolf packs cooperate, but they also they're very aggressive towards each other and stuff like that. And even humans, there's, evolutionary game theory supposedly is related to the fact that some humans are psychopaths, and humans have bloodlust and anger and all these other things that we wouldn't necessarily want an AGI to have. And then yet another problem is that if we're not good about what is the space of possibilities that the reward function is going to be plucked out of by this outer loop search process, then we could have the problem that every single possibility leads to a dangerous AGI. And then just doing the outer loop search doesn't help us at all.
That's right. So you just named two reasons why we shouldn't be too bullish on this kind of social evolution approach. You said different animals evolve different social instincts.
Yeah.
So you might not get human morality, you might get wolf morality. And also, like you said, game theory says that if everybody's too nice, then a psychopath is actually going to be the optimal strategy, and we don't want that. And then a couple from your writing that I've noted down is you said that it teaches AIs to align with AIs, so they might forget to align with humans.
Yeah, I mean, humans generalize their kindness towards babies and other humans towards charismatic animals like elephants, but not so much towards spiders and snakes and stuff. It's an open question. You wouldn't necessarily want to just leave it to chance and, this blind outer loop search process. Ideally, you would design it so that you know that it's going to generalize to not mass murdering humans is a good idea.
Right. Now, one more problem, I don't know if you explicitly wrote this out, but I think it's obvious, is just a singleton can emerge because the biological constraints don't apply. Specifically, like biologically, you can't just have a body the size of the world. You need to reproduce and have a community of bodies that all work together and interdependently. Whereas with an AI, you can just have a body the size of the world. You can just run code everywhere.
Yeah, there's sort of like a distinction without a difference between a singleton versus an army of a million clones that are cooperating with each other. And you don't need social instincts to cooperate with your clone because you already want the same thing.
Right. You can do top-down control.
Yeah, so that's another issue. I definitely think we should be thinking seriously about unified AI forces called singletons as opposed to, or at least in addition to, scenarios where there's multiple AIs working at cross purposes.
So to summarize this discussion here, I think you and I both agree that if you don't have a plan to make one AI aligned and you just put a bunch of them in a cage, right, and have them evolve together, I don't think you're going to get alignment out if you don't put alignment in.
Yeah, I think that's the likeliest thing. And then you'd just be reliant on testing or something. But, if you're going to do testing, then why don't you just design it through yourself?
Exactly. But to steal man, right? It's well, evolution made us and we're happy with how we came out. So I guess we both agree that there is a possibility that it'll pluck out the same kind of morality as us, but it just doesn't seem like that's what comes out of every run.
Yeah, I think there's some painting the target around the arrow when we look at how humans turned out.
Exactly. And of course, remember the constraint, we're biological, we have bodies. So if we're going to use biology and make the AI have physical bodies and generations and not be able to copy itself over the world, okay, I guess that increases our chance of success.
Yeah. And then, even once you do that, the real world is a distribution shift. Humans are doing very different things today than they were 2,000 years ago because we kept inventing new technology and that kept changing our options. And by the same token, AI is going to have options to invent new technology that it didn't have in in the training and test environment.
Have you ever read Dr. Ken Stanley's book about like divergence as opposed to like goal seeking?
No.
So Dr. Ken Stanley was a guest on Doom Debates. We had a spirited debate, and he's also an advisor to Softmax with Emmett Shear. He's a favorite intellectual opponent of mine because I have a very goal-oriented worldview, and he's coming in saying, you know what's really effective? Not having goals, just like aimlessly exploring the space, because then you actually get more exploration value. Like that's roughly his idea. Probably didn't represent that very well, but he's just like a good foil to a lot of my ideas, and that's why we had such a spirited debate. But when I look at softmax, for me, it's just like fundamentally based on these ideas that are hopeless. In their own words, they're like not trying to align top down, but they're having the AIs align with each other, and then humans will be part of this like aligned group. I don't even know. But I guess my point is just from my and your perspective, this is like way outside of plausibility, right?
Again, I'm hesitant to say anything too strong without having read more about where they're coming from. I'll just say that if they have a coherent vision that I haven't, it hasn't gotten into my thick skull yet.
Okay. Now, the point of doing the section we just did, where we went over ideas that seem obvious to us and yet are controversial, is I just want the viewers to understand that when we're among friends, this show is called Doom Debates, but when we're just talking among friends, we don't really see it as a debate. Like these are like long settled issues for us. So we don't see it as a doom debate. We just see it as doom.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair.
Okay. Like orthogonality thesis, like we don't see this as like this age-old philosophical question that we have to keep debating. We have to say it as like, yep, we know the answer.
Yeah, if you have desires about the future, then yeah, that one's annoying because people keep redefining the orthogonality thesis to mean different things, some of which are true and some of which are false. And we can't keep our terminology straight enough to, I don't know. People like to vibe that they're against the orthogonality thesis, but then if you probe into exactly, like I read this essay like last week or something where somebody was like against the orthogonality thesis, blah, 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 blah. But then, somewhere in the text was like, I grant that it is possible for, an AI to want to wipe out humanity. And I'm like, okay, then we don't actually disagree about the orthogonality thesis. You just don't like the vibe.
Right. Exactly. I think the issue here is society doesn't let us win philosophical wars. Kind of like in geopolitics, right? Okay, Russia invades Ukraine. Sorry, Russia, like you can't really win the war and take Ukraine's territory. That's not really cool. Which, maybe there's some logic to that, and maybe we shouldn't be letting countries winning wars, especially ones that they like started. Okay, so maybe that makes sense in geopolitics. But in philosophy, I think if somebody has a better idea about what makes sense in philosophy, I think we should let them win the war. You and I both agree that in quantum theory, many worlds should win the war. We shouldn't still be talking about the freaking Copenhagen interpretation. And similarly, like the orthogonality thesis, unfortunately, I have to debate it on my show because a lot of really smart, high-ranking people who have a lot of power still think it's false. But from your and my perspective, it's like it should just be allowed to win the war, that the orthogonality thesis is true.
Yeah, it's frustrating that bad ideas in philosophy and other areas live forever. Dan Dennett had memoirs where he talked about this, like there was like this growing philosophy consensus against some sub area of philosophy, I forget what, but then the people in that sub area launched a coup and managed to elect themselves into the leadership of the like philosophical professional organizations, and the battle waged on, and for all I know, it will never end.
Mm-hmm. All right, coming back to solving alignment. We talked about a relatively promising direction, your direction, for solving alignment being working on a reward function that is legible and seems to align with human values and tries to get the good stuff out of like the social motivations that the human brain has. I agree that that is a relatively promising direction, even though maybe it's not that promising. I think we're both on the same page. I want to point out that most AI companies and most of the tech industry non-doomers, they're not even realizing that this is a direction we need to go in. They're like so obsessed with LLMs, right? And they're like structuring their whole research program around that. Like they're not seeing one step ahead.
I mean, if they're working on LLMs and they're trying to do alignment that is tailored towards LLMs, then that's like understandable. What really gets me is the people who are trying to push forward RL and model-based RL agents towards AGI, and they say that they're trying to do that, and they spend like all of 5 minutes of their life thinking about what would be a good reward function as the AI gets more and more powerful. It is also true that the LLM people are doing more and more reinforcement learning, and I think they have not thought carefully enough about the implications of that change in their training protocols.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to touch on outer versus inner alignment because you've explained that well, and it was actually a little bit different than how I've been thinking about it. So I think we both agree that inner misalignment means goal misgeneralization, meaning like you're getting these signals, you're getting upvotes and downvotes or some other kind of reward signals, and you think that you know how to optimize the signals you're going to get, but the model you've built of how to optimize them turned out to be very different from the model of the generator of the signals.
Yeah, or at least what was intended. I should clarify that outer and inner misalignment come in different variations depending on the AI paradigm. I think this is the useful way to think about it for actor-critic reinforcement learning. So inner misalignment would be when the critic is, so the critic is the thing, remember, that, I think I'm going to close the window and the critic is guessing based on life experience that that's a good idea or a bad idea. Yeah, so the critic is taking this sort of rich semantic plan involving the world model and guessing whether it's going to be good or bad according to the reward function, which is the sort of dumber thing that doesn't understand everything about the world. So you can get mismatches where the critic thinks that something is good or bad in a way that does not match how the reward function would be rewarding that plan or, punishing that plan. I like to give examples like if I did cocaine, then it would be very rewarding, but I don't do cocaine because I don't want to get addicted. So that's kind of a form of inner misalignment in that the reward function would say that cocaine is a good idea, but the critic is saying that cocaine is a bad idea, so I don't do it.
So if I understand correctly, inner misalignment can't happen during training. It's the difference between how the AI is going to behave in training versus production. Because in production, it thinks that it's going to get a high reward for like doing cocaine, or I don't even. It thinks that there's some actions like, oh, this is the best action. I'm going to get such a high reward. And if it was back in training, it would have actually gotten a low reward, but it misgeneralized.
It's a little different for me because I'm thinking about these sort of continuous learning paradigms where you never stop doing the RL. I'm doing the RL in my own brain right now. I've been doing it for my whole life. So if you have an AI like that, then it's true that as soon as you do something, it's no longer out of distribution and it's no longer a generalization thing. But inner misalignment can still be a big issue if, for example, if I'm not taking cocaine because I don't want to get addicted, that's a form of inner misalignment, but it's not going to get corrected because I never do take the cocaine. And a more scary example would be if I go in to get surgery to change my reward function or something, or I start taking some drug like Ozempic or something that changes my reward function. That would get corrected, but by the time it gets corrected, it's too late.
Right. Now, when you use the cocaine example, I feel like it's misleading because we generally think of cocaine being like a bad outcome to get addicted to cocaine. Just that's how it feels in most discussions. But you're saying that your emotions actually intend to reward you for doing cocaine, and you're missing out on the prediction of that signal.
Yeah, this is an important point. So like, we're usually thinking about it from our own perspective, and from our own perspective, inner misalignment is a good thing because, we're painting the target around the arrow. The things that we want are the things that we want. And if our reward function wants something different, then so much the worse for our reward function. But if we put on the shoes of being an AGI programmer and imagining that we have put something in the reward function that we're expecting to steer the motivations of our AI, and the AI says, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to edit my own reward function. I'm going to create a subagent that has a different reward function or whatever else, some irreversible action. That could be problematic because it makes it hard to reason about what the AI is going to do. And maybe it's going to be doing things that we didn't want it to do.
Totally. Okay, so moving on to outer alignment, you call that specification gaming and reward hacking. So the idea there is that the agent, maybe it knows perfectly well, it is good at predicting what reward it's going to get. It's just that it predicts that it could do all these counterintuitive moves, like taking over the world or killing the operator or whatever. It's correctly predicting that it can do these undesirable moves and then maximize its reward from the reward function.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a classic thing in the reinforcement learning literature. People have kind of forgotten about it in the LLM era, but if you reward for getting a high score in a buggy game, then the AI often learns to exploit the bugs, and maybe you didn't intend that. But if you go into the real world with all of its complexities, often a good way to get a high score, reward for the human being happy, then maybe it's gonna like lock you in prison on a heroin drip, like they say.
Now, what you're calling inner and outer misalignment, I think that's a really good distinction that makes sense. But I think that I've been lumping them both together into inner misalignment because I think there's yet another layer of outer alignment, which is we as the human race even knowing what to write down as the reward function.
Yeah, I guess I kind of lump that in with like other parts of the safe and beneficial AGI problem, which I'm definitely very interested in. And it all has to tie into a coherent story. It's easy to like write a book that says this is what we want AGI to do, but that's no good if we don't actually know how to write code for that book. And there's sort of constraints that all connect to each other. Like if there's only so many things that we can program an AGI to do, then we have to like work around that when we're trying to brainstorm what we actually want the AGI to be doing in the first place.
Let me play with your terminology really quick. So you have an AI, you just trained it, you tried to train it to be good, and now it's in production. It's not getting trained anymore. And then it goes and does something Machiavellian. If it did something Machiavellian because it thought that you were going to give it a high reward for that if this was training time and it was wrong, then that would be inner misalignment. But if it acted Machiavellian because it correctly predicted that you screwed up what reward you were going to give it and it actually got a high reward, now it's being outer misaligned.
I would disagree when you start talking about the training versus deployment distinction, because again, I think everything is training because I'm in this sort of continuous learning paradigm.
Okay, it's just when you talk about inner misalignment, I feel like it's like an important piece of the puzzle that it has to be mispredicting how the reward function is going to work.
It doesn't have to be factually wrong. Like I have a correct factual belief about how I would feel if I took cocaine, but I still don't want to take cocaine because I don't care about feeling good. I care about other things too.
You know that you would get rewarded if you did cocaine, but you're deciding not to do it because so it's another type of misalignment. It doesn't come from an incorrect prediction. It just comes from like some other facet of how you're deciding things.
Yeah, it's a sort of visceral desire to take cocaine or not take cocaine, and just understanding the world better doesn't give you that visceral desire by and large.
Right. Okay, and let's go back to the very outermost layer. You know what you don't even call outer. I've been calling it outer alignment, which is the idea of translating from this mess of morality that's encoded in our brain down to like some giant wish. You know, like what do we truly want, or you might call it a specification for heaven, right? Like what's going to happen in heaven? Let's design. Let's talk to the architect. Let's build heaven.
Yeah, it's hard to know. There's a lot of scary things happening as AGI comes about, and it would be great to have like any plan at all that avoids extinction. I'm trying to piece together a plausible plan, but I don't really have one
It
yet.
feels to me like you're sidestepping that problem, right? Like you're saying, yeah, specification for heaven, that would be nice to have, but that is only going to happen in your order of operations. And again, I'm not saying you're confident in your plan, right? You're just doing the best you can, but it sounds like you're ordering things like, yeah, well, we'll just have a super intelligent AI that shares a lot of human social instincts and like it'll ponder what's a spec for heaven.
Um, I don't love that plan. I feel like it's all I can do to come up with any plan at all. It is true that if humans are able to come up with a spec for heaven, then AIs in principle are able to too, if they have the same innate drives, inductive biases, training environment, and so on. It's not really realistic to get all of those exactly right. And then who knows what's going to happen. If I lived in a world where I thought I could write down any spec and, have it happen, then I don't know, I would presumably want to like have the AI defer to some kind of process, like the long reflection or something, to like set that up and defer to whatever results, hand power over to whatever, humanity as a whole in some sort of more fair and democratic way decides. I don't know how to turn a spec like that into code. So then like, is it possible to, just make an AI that, destroys all the GPUs like people sometimes joke about? I don't know. I don't really know how to do that one either. Just sort of navigating out of this treacherous circumstances seems like a hard problem.
Right. I mean, I think the Roman Yampolsky position is largely based on the difficulty of what I call outer alignment, where he's like, look, whatever you write down, it's not really going to be what you truly want once you optimize it.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. That's kind of the situation that humanity's always been in because we have our innate drives and each generation goes off in whatever direction. And, we're kind of happy about that. I guess we don't really have much choice. But when we hand power to the next generation, they're going to go optimize what they want to optimize and live the lives that they want to live. And we don't get to control that. And we just have to hope for the best.
Okay. These AI companies, it's a common trope for them to talk about AI helping AI alignment in like this incremental, I guess you'd call it scalable oversight, right? Is that basically what that term means?
That's part of it. I think I would kind of define scalable oversight differently if I'm understanding it correctly.
Okay. Well, let's just say AI is helping AI solve alignment, or as Eliezer calls it, the AI will do our AI alignment homework.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like throwing shade without a good argument behind it. But I do think that it's bad.
Yeah, well, let me steal man, because your
Okay.
particular flavor of AI alignment, where you're trying to reverse engineer how human social instincts work in the human brain steering system, that particular alignment direction seems like something that I could imagine an AI actually accelerating.
So these connectomics companies are hiring ML researchers, and I hope that they get really good ones and that they use AI to, help figure out what the connections are in their, sliced brain scans. I, use LLMs not much, but a little bit, and I'm happy to use them. I'm happy for people to use AIs as they can to help with AI alignment, just like they should use any other tools. But that's different from what people are often talking about, which is like delegating to AIs. And I think that has some chicken and egg and other problems that can't be resolved.
Right. And I think the other problem is just that by the time that AIs are really good at helping us at research, we will have kicked off that FOOM.
Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah, so we got to figure it out pre-FOOM.
Yeah, so that's like one corner of the chicken and egg problem. And then the other corner is if the AI doesn't want to help us with alignment, then that's bad. But we need to solve alignment to make an AI that wants to help us with alignment.
Yep. Let's talk about AI policy. I'm a member of Pause AI. I just think we should probably pause AI, try to keep it at the current level, try to do intelligence augmentation, or at least do more research on current AIs. I'm not thrilled with this proposal. I'm not excited. I wish that I could just see more cool tech coming out, but I just think it's kind of crazy to go forward at this point. Now, you've written that you're actually not that bullish on Pause AI as a proposal, even though you have a 90% doom. So explain yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that LLMs are going to plateau before they get to a very, very powerful and scary and dangerous AI. And instead, it's going to be some future paradigm and some future paradigm that requires a lot less compute. So I think that the central bottleneck between us and the scary AI is people playing around with toy models and publishing on archive and GitHub. And I don't think that the sort of pause AI actions so far are going to be effective at dissuading those researchers. I guess I should first say that I think on the margin, it would be good to buy time. It would be very good to buy time before superintelligence because I think we are not ready for superintelligence, but we're making incremental progress. I don't think that buying time is like the only thing or the most important thing. I would just as soon have, more people do good research in this area. But it is a thing that I think would be good on the margin, on the current margin. If AI was, 10,000 years away, then then I'd be like, oh, well, on that margin, I want AI to come sooner. But on the current margin, I would want it to be later. So in that sense, I'm
Mhm.
sort of ideologically aligned with Pause AI's goals. But I think that actually pausing AI involves, pausing this kind of like tinkering around in research that seems very
Right.
hard and impractical to actually slow down.
In other words, you're on the same page as me that it would be great to choke off AI development if we could find a choke point. But the problem is that the only choke points people are talking about is like training runs, right? If it's a large training run or an expensive training run, then it's illegal to do it. That's what everybody's talking about. That's what I actually support. But I think you're correctly pointing out that that's not that great of a choke point because even just a random guy in his lab, an independent researcher such as yourself, what are you up to, Steve? But an independent researcher could just be getting us to that breakthrough, the next breakthrough, and the choke point just doesn't do anything. In fact, the choke point might even redirect some effort toward the more dangerous stuff.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, that's basically where I'm coming from.
So you even had an argument that pause AI is like net negative if it redirects effort.
I mean, I think that effect kind of rounds to zero. And
Mhm.
mostly I just sort of feel neutral about it.
Are there any other policies that you wish people would adopt?
Um, yeah, I don't really have any strong takes on that. I usually leave that to the policy people.
Yeah. Honestly, same here. I mean, the point of this show is basically just fear mongering, just to make people realize, hey guys, we're doomed, right? And then people ask, so what should we do, Liron? I'm like, I don't know if I've gotten that far, okay, but I just think most people are walking around not even knowing that we're doomed, and I feel like I can do my part by at least opening their eyes to the doom.
Yeah, you're doing good work.
Thanks. Do you think that fear mongering is good?
Um, I would like people to have accurate beliefs about the future of AI, and they can feel how they feel about those accurate beliefs. But I think that the accurate beliefs would involve that, like, we are on track to make AI that wants to kill its programmers and kill its users and kill everybody else, and that it's a hard technical problem, and that it's not the kind of thing we can just iterate our way out of when it's already happening for lots of like deep reasons about, safety being hard to test and, irreversible problems. I think that we are inviting this new intelligent species onto the planet, and it's, nobody's asking permission, they're just doing it. And it's going to be this species of psychopathic, hostile AIs, and this is like really bad. And I do think that it would be good if people knew about that, insofar as that's true.
Yep. Okay, well then riddle me this. You're talking in a calm voice, you're having a good time getting interviewed, but do you feel terrified?
I think my mood is not mostly dependent on that. I'm still more upset by, my kid cutting his knee than, or I don't know, every now and then I'll shed a tear about the coming doom, and like how hard these things are to solve, and that I'm not making more progress, and I'll feel frustrated and I'll feel other things. But mostly on a day-to-day basis, I'm just trying to do the best I can and live my life.
Yeah, totally. I was jogging on the road the other day, and there's like no sidewalk, and the cars were like passing pretty close. And I'm like, the feat that I'm doing in terms of like how intuitively scared I should be right now, I should be like way scareder than handling a snake right now in terms of like how much bravery and recklessness I'm showing by like running close to these cars. But my intuition hasn't really caught up, right? I don't really have an intuition to be like, oh my God, running close to a car? That is like so scary. That's like a tiger is like baring its jaws at you. I just, my hypothalamus and brainstem just haven't gotten the message yet because I haven't had enough generations to evolve that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, right. So similarly, it's like, okay, we're all doomed from AI, but I don't, I just don't have that firmware to be scared.
Yeah. If there's a spider crawling up your leg, that's going to be a stronger reaction than me announcing on a podcast that your most likely cause of death is AI.
Exactly. All right. So we're on the same page about that. Okay. You ready for the lightning round?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, these are like huge topics that could be their own interviews, but for us, it's just the lightning round. All right. So offense, defense, balance. Where do you stand? Which side's going to win?
I tend to be very strongly on the offense side.
I think so too. And I don't know if there's like one simple answer, but what about this? Oh, you're a physicist. Great. So I'm going to ask you the physics aspect, the low level physics aspect. Don't you think that the ability to dump energy into any cube of space is like a huge advantage for the attacker?
Yeah. It's easier to destroy than to create. There's also a thing where power begets power if you're sufficiently not norm following. Like, in the zombie apocalypse movies, you have one zombie that makes two zombies that makes three zombies. I'm expecting AI to be like running one inference copy per chip as opposed to per data center. So as soon as the AI hacks into another chip, it's doubling its strength, and then it gets another chip and it doubles its strength again, another two chips. So that's like another sort of way that the world is unstable.
So when we ask whether offense or defense wins, maybe that's equivalent to asking whether the best defense is a good offense, right? And it kind of feels like the answer is yes, because if you have really good defenses, but your borders are small, it's like, how good are your defenses really going to be? Isn't it going to be super tempting strategically to increase your borders? And in that case, doesn't that just mean offense is more powerful than defense?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of like mutually assured destruction and stuff. I don't know. There's a whole discourse on it, and this is a short answer as opposed to going into length about all the backs and
Right.
forths.
Okay. Right. Exactly. We've already exceeded the time of lightning round, but consider this. Okay. I have an argument for defense, which is you can defend the 2D boundaries of 3D spheres of space, and it's the 2D boundary is relatively small. You can do a lot of 3D stuff inside of that boundary. But I think I might also be arguing for like this is why you want to control as much territory as possible because the boundary is relatively easy to defend.
I think I don't put too much stock into arguments at that level of abstraction. Like, I would want to be talking about like missile defense is hard, even though missiles have to pass through an area because they're just moving really fast and they have a bomb at the end of them. But what about plagues? I don't know. We can go on all day about different types of threats.
I think you and I can both agree that intelligence is going to foom beyond human levels so quickly that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what these like physical properties are in terms of, who has a fundamental advantage because the AI is just going to plow its way toward engineering a solution either way.
Yeah, I'm expecting one AI that has the ability to take over the world and run the world by itself if it wants to. And then the hope is that its motivations are going to be good.
Likewise. I just have one more thought in my notes that I think is worth sharing about offense versus defense, which is that let's say defense wins and defense is easier than offense. Okay, fine, but the first fooming AI that's playing offense is quickly going to reverse its role, and now it's defending its territory, and now we've lost.
Yeah, you would have to defend against the AI. That's right.
So I guess the reason I'm bringing all this up is I just feel like people who say that we might get lucky because defense is easier than offense. I'm just seeing a lot of problems with that. I'm not seeing a lot of lucky signs there.
Yeah. Again, defense against advanced persistent threat, state level hackers is insufficient. If you have a million times scaled up, NSA, that's going to be able to hack into everything. And then the way to defend against that is to say, oh, we have our own million times scaled up NSA that's going to, patch all the bugs. But then that just says, okay, well, then that one's the one that we need to be worried about being misaligned.
Yep. Exactly right. Like the mongoose that ate the snake for you, and now it's like the mongoose is the threat.
Yeah.
All right. What is your P simulation?
I think it's that we live in a real world, not a world that's simulated by some other animate entity. But I don't know how to assign a probability to that.
Come on, you got to give me a ballpark here.
If I were to pull a number out of my ass, I guess I would say 1% or something.
Wow, only one. Okay, I'm 50. Wow. Okay, we should have had the whole debate about that. All right, and actually, my P-Doom is only 50%. I'm 50% P-Doom, 50% P-simulation. You're 90% P-Doom, 1% P-simulation. That's funny.
We got lots of disagreements. That's fine.
There's a lot of different positions people can have. Yeah, I've noticed that. All right. Last lightning round question. Thoughts on AI mass unemployment, or as some call it, gradual disempowerment?
I endorse the Eliezer quote where he said, worrying about the impact of machine superintelligence on the employment market is like worrying about the impact on U.S.-China trade relations of the moon crashing into the Earth. Yes, there would be an impact, but you're kind of missing the point. I think ASI is going to be, this new intelligent, radical species on our planet that's going to probably wipe out all humans. And if not, then we have, losing our job is the last thing that I think people should have on their mind.
Yeah, we both agree that that's a good problem to have because it means we haven't all died.
Yeah.
The only way that I've changed my mind, though, is I think that even if we end up having this good problem to have, it's actually not an easy fix. It's not like, oh, just give everybody universal basic income and give them hobbies. It's not an easy fix because I actually just think that once we're fortunate enough to be dealing with gradual disempowerment, we're still going to get disempowered.
If you have an AI as singleton, then it can, then you're not necessarily subject to the types of competitive races to the bottom that I understand were the focus of the gradual disempowerment paper. And I'm not thrilled about the idea of an AI singleton. I think it's kind of terrifying, but for better or worse, that is actually what I'm expecting right now.
Yeah, it's interesting to observe that your good scenario, which again, you're not super confident about it, but at least you're giving it a shot. It's a good scenario where we have these powerful autonomous AIs that have internalized human social instincts and basically are good, but are also quite autonomous and independent. And in that scenario, they can just help give us a share of the power.
Yeah. Keep us in metaphorical zoos, which is that's not.
But a better version of a zoo.
Better version of
a zoo. A lot of enrichment.
Yeah, it's only mildly dystopian, as opposed to
Yeah, that could be another doom scenario is gradual zoo animalness, where it's okay, you're getting everything you want, but you just have to live with the idea that you're ultimately somebody else's pet.
I mean, it's just hard to imagine that humans are going to ultimately wind up in control of the fate of the universe when it would be like putting a 5-year-old in charge of the Fed.
Yeah.
There are people who have much more experience, who are more thoughtful and, more intelligent and more competent in every imaginable way by a giant factor. So why would you put a 5-year-old in charge of the Fed? So if AI doesn't kill us all, then it's good. I imagine we're going to be in this position where AI is going to be in a much better position to make decisions.
All right, viewers, so this has clearly been a very long and wide-ranging conversation. Steve is a real well of knowledge. If you want more of those knowledge drops, just go to his website. It's linked to it in the show notes. There's so many good articles. We're just scratching the surface in this conversation. And I think you can also see Steve is knowledgeable about so many different things that when he makes some progress in his research, or when the AI world is making some progress and more new things are coming up, he's definitely going to be somebody that I want to turn to ask him more questions and help make sense of this kind of stuff. And then finally, the thing to point out about Steve is that he's actually doing a direct shot at the AI alignment problem in a way that's not obviously wrong and hopeless. He's actually taking a serious shot, and he may actually be one of the top people in the world who could actually help humanity out, solve this problem. So Steve, thanks for doing that. And thank you for coming on Doom Debates.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I had a great time.
Big thanks to Dr. Stephen Byrnes for coming on the show, and from my perspective, telling the truth, just telling it like it is. I want to reiterate, it's amazing that he's actually working on the problem as somebody who understands the problem. He's not just thinking about how to make AIs be politically correct. He's not thinking about how current generation LLMs can be fine-tuned better so they can make more money. He's certainly not coming on Doom Debates and requiring me to convince him of all the obvious stops on the Doom train. He's already got it down. He's so far ahead of where everybody else is, but he is where millions of us need to be. Where our conversation is, that's where the Overton window needs to be. Unfortunately, as you can see, we've got a long way to go. So please do your part. You can support the show. First things first, like, subscribe, comment, feed the algorithm. But there's another reason why you're going to want to be going to doomdebates.com and smacking the subscribe button there, giving me your email address. We've got a couple amazing episodes coming out. I just announced there's going to be an episode with Vitalik Buterin very soon. And there's even going to be an episode with my #1 intellectual role model. That's right, Eliezer Yudkowsky. You're not going to want to miss those episodes, but you will miss them. Unless you go to doomdebates.com and type in your email address and subscribe right now. It helps the show. It helps the Stephen Byrnes of the world get more support for their cause. You're doing your part to support the mission, which I appreciate. So please go do that now. Doomdebates.com, type your email, subscribe. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Doom Debates.